Okay, good morning, everybody. So just to give you a little bit of an outline, or let me just say a little bit of structure. Today we're going to really start with the nuts and bolts of theory and research and what trauma is, but I'm going to tell you it's not real academia focused. I have tried to make it understandable, not because I'm questioning your capacity to understand, but so we can go back to our workplaces and share it with people and they'll get it. And it's in language that they'll understand. And then tomorrow we're going to address more specifics about, okay, what's the application in our fields? And how do we apply it to our different realms? So that said, I'll introduce myself. I am Lauren Smith. I am the owner and CEO of a multi-service social service agency called Finally Home. I am also the owner of Lauren Smith Consulting, where I work with organizations to help structure both processes and programs in trauma-informed ways. I am the mother of 20 children. I have 15 children that are adopted, 5 biological children, and we have traditionally taken the children that were a little on the higher end, so they're a little bit naughty. And so as I speak, some of the interventions I talk about are not going to be some theory. They're going to be things that I have used and continue to use every day. The picture behind me, that picture is about 4 years old, and so there are now 20 more of us that should have been in that picture, but that is my family, my children, their partners, and my grandchildren. And we also now have great-grandchildren. So in order to best serve and support children who've been impacted by trauma, as well as the families with whom they live, we have to really understand the impact of trauma on brain development. So I'm going to give you just a quick little quiz, and we can do it out loud, but the most critical time for brain development is in the first 5 years of life. True or false? Okay, that is a false statement. The most critical time of brain development is in utero. The second most critical time of brain development is that first year. So think about those ramifications, because before we even know that baby as a person, their brain has already been hardwired. Okay, 2, trauma is a distressing event that is experienced by a person. Trauma is a distressing event that is experienced by a person. False. That is false. That is part of it, but trauma can also just be the brain's response to adverse circumstances. So why is that important? Because sometimes we deal with children that have no cognitive recall of the things that have happened to them, but their body always knows. 3, if we focus on the brain and interventions instead of behaviors, we may get more results. That is true. If we focus on behaviors, we're not bringing healing to the root of the issues. If we work on the brain being healed, the behaviors will fall in line behind it. Okay. Next, neuropathways in the brain can be altered until death. That is true. There is great research with Alzheimer patients. 400 to 500 positive responses to the same negative stimuli will change a neuropathway. Genetics are the primary determiner of behavioral issues. I would agree. It's false. They do play a role, and they play more important of a role than perhaps I would have thought 25 years ago. But my question is, if anyone has done any research in the epigenetic realm, my question is are core level genetics, or is it multi-generational trauma that has been embedded in the DNA? Early trauma can result in lifelong challenges.
True.
That is true. And therapy is the best intervention for early trauma. That's absolutely false. The best intervention for early trauma are stable, secure, and consistent relationships. Okay, so here are the risk factors in brain development. First is a difficult pregnancy. So what qualifies as that? Exposure to substances in utero. Exposure to domestic violence in utero. Stress. And it can even be good stress, because the brain can't distinguish between good stress and bad stress. So I'll give you an example. My sister was a nanny for 3 children. Mom was a neonatologist. Dad was a cancer surgeon. So educated, very upper middle class family, had all the help they needed, not a lot of stressors. But their oldest child, who was 5, was off the chain. And she would call me every day and say, I need you to give me some interventions. I have never nannied for a child like this. And the more she talked, the more I realized it sounded like he was a child impacted by trauma. And so I said, go ask Mom what was happening when she was pregnant with him. She came back to the phone. She said she was in residency. Poor sleep, poor nutrition, high stress. She didn't mean to do anything negative to her baby, but it happened. The distinguishing factor with that, though, is at least she had a healthy attachment, and so the behaviors were much easier to pull into place. The second thing is a difficult birth. Unplanned C-section, premature birth, forceps delivery, frequent hospitalizations or medical procedures, particularly in the first 3 years of life. So a baby who begins life in the NICU is very, very high on the chart for having been impacted by trauma. And then, of course, abuse, neglect, and trauma. So most, if not all of the kids that we serve, with everyone represented here, have experienced those risk factors. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain. And again, I'm going to very oversimplify it, so I probably won't present this at a neurological seminar. But I want to make it where we all can get it and be fluent with it. So we're going to kind of look at the brain 3 parts today. So the first is the brainstem, and the brain develops from the brainstem forward. So we have the brainstem. I'll just say 2 things about it. It is responsible for all of our autonomic responses. So the stuff we don't think about, like breathing, digesting, all that stuff that just happens. The other thing is, think about the hardest pouring rain you've ever stood in. That may have been yesterday. That's how fast brain cells are multiplying shortly after conception. When any of those risk factors are present, it is actually hardwiring the brain for fear and mistrust instead of trust and safety. So it is, in essence, creating a glass half empty kiddo. We then have the limbic region, which is the survival part of the brain, and then the frontal precortex, which is the last to develop. And I'm going to talk about that, and then we're going to go camp out in the middle a little longer. The frontal precortex is responsible for cause and effect, logic, reasoning, and what I like to call functional conscience. Here's what I mean by that. If I were to take my children to Publix, which I will never do, but if I were to take them to Publix and they smelled someone that was giving samples out and they smelled the food, their brains would say, you're starving, and if you don't eat right now, you're going to probably die. And so they would go through the store, they would find something to eat, open it up, throw the wrapper on the floor. If I'm lucky, it might go in the mini garbage cans they have in Publix. But it would never occur to them that they're stealing. That's what I mean by functional conscience, because they're not driven by those higher level thinking skills. Now we'll go into the middle part of the brain, and we'll talk about 3 parts: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the pituitary gland. So again, the limbic region is the survival part of the brain. We see it in fight, freeze, and what is now called fawning, or it's really just submission. So the amygdala is the fear receptor of the brain. The hippocampus is responsible for short-term memory, for the storage of cortisol, and it's responsible for how we index and store information. So let me explain that one a little bit further. We're going through all of this training today, and you'll go back to your workplace or home tonight or read an email and you'll go, oh, we talked about that today, and your brain will retrieve the information. But in the trauma-impacted brain, we're taking that information and it's like throwing a ball into a roulette wheel and we're spinning it. And it's going bum, 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 and it lands somewhere. And so 5 minutes later, an hour later, 2 weeks later, the brain goes to access the information and can't find it because the brain storage is so chaotic. Here's what it looks like in school. Johnny is in reading, and the teacher says, A says, and he says 3. He goes a couple hours. Now he's in reading. Now he's in math. And the teacher says 5 plus 5. And he says 10. Because those concepts from 3 hours ago, his brain just finally found them. And he can spit them out. What does he get diagnosed with? ADHD, right? When it's not, it's just his brain couldn't find it. The pituitary gland is responsible for growth, sexual function, and it serves as kind of an internal compass that helps us orient to the different environments that we're in. So here's how it works. We hear running and banging and screaming out the door, and someone says active shooter. Don't freak out, it's never happened, and I'm here a lot so far. But it's a good example. What do? Do we just continue with our presentation? No, everyone's going to get up and move, right? You don't sit back and go, there's an active shooting in the building. Let me look up the protocol of what we're supposed to do, and let me talk about my options with a couple people. We don't do any of that because our brain has said to our amygdala, survive. And so we go duck in a corner, make sure we're safe. We do what we need to do to be safe because we're now in that survival part of our brain. And depending on our personality, we fight, flight, or freeze. Okay? So that happens and we get a burst of cortisol because the amygdala has now yelled at the hippocampus and said, give me a burst of cortisol. Well, cortisol is a stress hormone, but in that little burst, it's a calming hormone. So I get to a safe place, I can breathe, we hear the all clear sounded in the halls, and I move on with my day. The problem is, for children who've experienced trauma, it's as if someone has duct taped their amygdala down. So it's constantly screaming at the hippocampus, which then is constantly releasing cortisol. And there's 2 problems with that. One is cortisol outside the hippocampus is toxic. And so it's like pouring bleach over the child's brain in that moment. The other issue is that it forms a crystal-like substance in this part of the brain, and it renders the child incapable of accessing their frontal precortex while the levels are that high. And so we truly have children that are caught in survival mode. Think about what that looks like for you. Think about being in the worst part of town, highest crime area, 3 o'clock in the morning, and you run out of gas. And you got to walk from your car past that park you know that shootings happen at every night to get to that gas station you can see about a quarter mile down the road. You can bet everything about you is on high alert, right? Are you thinking about what you're going to cook tomorrow? Are you thinking about what you learned earlier in the day? Are you thinking about how much you love other people and want to do things for them? No, you're not thinking of any of that. You're thinking of, how do I get to that gas station without getting a bullet in my back? Survival. That's where a lot of our kids live, that hyper alert state. So here's a common story. A little boy walks in the kitchen. He smells dinner cooking, and he says, "Mommy, I'm hungry. Can I have a snack?" To which she says, "Not now. Dinner's going to be ready in a few minutes." It's something you really like. And all of a sudden, little boy loses his mind, erupts into a rage, and says, "You're a bad mom. You hate me. You never do anything for me. You ruin my life." And so on and so forth. Runs to his room, slams the door, toys start hitting the wall, furniture's being flipped over, and you can hear the sounds of rage echo off all the walls in the house. What happened? So let's look at it through the TBRI lens. So children from hard places can cause volatile and unpredictable behaviors that look like significant mental health issues. But are they? So when we have chronic activation of the fear response system, it's driven by primitive brain structures, which includes the amygdala. We just talked about it. It's designed to only be activated during crisis situations, but for our population, because they live in crisis situations, it becomes chronic, and there is chronic activation of the amygdala. In this state, the amygdala, which is responsible for the activation of our sympathetic nervous system, okay, and the release of adrenaline and other stress hormones, becomes what we would call a cruel taskmaster. Many people refer to it as the hijack of the amygdala hijack, because it hijacks the rest of the brain. Now let's go back to that quiz just to remind you where I said, where we talk about the curing from this doesn't just go away. It is altering every part of a child's being. It is not a behavior issue. It is a brain that's activated too easily due to chronic stress. If we take away the overactivity of the amygdala, we're going to see a calming of the behaviors. I'll give you an example. I was seeing a family the other night. Child is 9, and mom said, before dinner, go in your room, change your clothes, change into your jammies, and then put your shoes away and come back out. And he erupted into a rage. He put a hole in the wall, kicked the door off the door frame, turned his dresser over. Okay? And when we got to the bottom of it, it was because he heard, "Go to your room and stay there." And I said, "Buddy, I was standing right here by mom. That's really not what mom said," once we could process it. But that is what he heard. And that was what he responded to. Why? Because he lives in that chronic amygdala activation, and it didn't take very much. Learning and memory about emotionally charged experience is an additional function and can cause a lot of childhood traumas to become seated in the memory. The Body Keeps the Score. I think that's a must read for everyone, but what we have to understand is everything we experience from in utero forward is embedded in us cellularly. It is there. And although our mind may not remember, our body always does. I saw this play out a couple years ago in myself, and I'd been teaching it for years, but I got it. And I woke up one morning and I was just low. And that's really out of character for me. I'm a morning person, and I'm up and ready to go, and sun will come out tomorrow. It's more my personality. But I didn't feel that way, and I was trying to analyze why. Couldn't figure it out. So I sat in my car, and I start my day by praying, and all of a sudden my phone dings, and I look down, and it's a Facebook message. And my sister had said something about honoring today, the day that our mom died. And I went, oh, my body knew. It's been years. We've grieved it. I don't have ongoing issues with it, but my body still knew that it was a really hard day. And I responded. And I thought, how much more for children who don't have the coping strategies that we as adults do. Although children could be in a safe place now, they still live in a world of potential dangers and are always being threatened. Because again, that's what their brain's telling them. I'm hardwired for fear and mistrust. So when I go to school, everything around me is a potential threat. Any overstimulating environment. And then again, they're caught between the amygdala and a hard place. So here are the types of trauma. We talked about in utero, and now we'll talk about acute, chronic, and complex. And it's important to understand the differences because I think it also informs how we walk into finding resources and helping children. Because it's very different to deal with a child that their trauma was a grandparent dying as opposed to a child that was exposed to substances in utero and then abused and then put into 5 or 6 foster homes and then hospitalized because their immune system was compromised and they got really sick. Do you hear what I'm saying? That's going to be a really different situation to work on recovery from than for the child that had that one-time experience. So again, trauma is not necessarily a specific experience that one can describe. It can be the brain's response to early adverse factors. I'm a little surprised with all the research, but there are still many professionals in our world that don't understand that. Well, they're too young. They don't remember what happened to them. Oh yeah, they do. Because it hardwired their brain before they even had any choices on what to remember or not remember. Acute trauma is a psychological trauma that occurs in response to a single, highly stressful event. Natural disaster, bad car accident, witnessing violence. Okay? And acute trauma can lead to long-term mental health problems if not appropriately addressed. But it is a single, highly stressful event, acute trauma. Chronic trauma is ongoing or repeated traumatic experiences. So it differs from acute trauma because it's not just one time. So examples would be physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, domestic violence, poverty. I want to camp for just a minute on poverty because how many of us or how many of our colleagues actually see poverty as a trauma? How many of our birth parents don't have transportation and they're told they have to get a job, they have to get housing, they have to visit their child once a week, and they have to attend all the court hearings. And by the way, your visits are going to be from 1 to 2 during the day. So how am I going to find a job? And I don't have transportation, so I have to take a bus. So what's a 1-hour visit for me is 4 or 5 hours, if I'm lucky. But then if I miss it, so I'm just saying, do you think that's a little bit of stress for some of our birth parents? And I think because most of us live different lives, we forget to take into consideration the additional stressors that people in poverty experience. Complex trauma is the next type, and it is a type of stress similar to generational trauma. And it happens when someone experiences multiple, chronic, or prolonged exposure to traumatizing events. Can happen to both children and adult. But complex trauma, like abandonment trauma, for example, are more common among those who experienced abuse or neglect during childhood. Complex trauma can cause long-term problems with physical and mental health. Okay, forming and maintaining healthy relationships is also a profound challenge. I don't perceive anything as safe. So I developed these indicators of living in the survival part of the brain. And I'll just briefly look at this with you. So the first and foremost is control. These kiddos have to be in charge of everything. And remember, a lot of the families that we work with too are just grown-up trauma-impacted kiddos. So they're going to have the same things. But control is number one. Remember, I'm hardwired for fear and mistrust. So I have to be in control of everything because I'm the only one who can meet my needs and I'm the only one who can keep me safe. So therefore, I have to have the last word. I have question, where are we going? What are we doing? Why are we doing it? I have to be in control. The second thing we see is hypervigilance. Okay, hypervigilance is that being in that neighborhood in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning and stepping out of my car, everything about me is on high alert. And so I'm walking toward that gas station and a piece of paper blows in front of me and I jump about 10 feet. Would I jump about 10 feet if I were there at 12 in the afternoon? No, because I'd see what it was. I wouldn't be in that state of hypervigilance. The most frequent misdiagnosis for hypervigilance is ADHD. The next thing that we see are sensory overload. So generally, kids have one sensory that's more problematic than others. Okay? But you can watch it happen. I'm working with a little boy in Lakeland and he had a bad week and mom and dad don't get it because they adopted to save a child and he's not letting them save him. And it's really a struggle. But they couldn't understand why he had a bad week. And I said, well, Mom, weren't you out of town last week for work? Yeah. Wasn't his teacher out because she was sick? Yeah. I said, okay. Have you thought that maybe he was so overwhelmed in his environment that his senses overloaded, he needed much more physical exertion and sensory input? And she went, oh. And then said, so are you telling me I need to not travel for my job? I said, I'm not telling you that at all. I'm telling you to see through the lens of what happens to a child. And yes, he was in sensory overload, and so everything he did was ramped up quite a bit. Okay, the next indicator, there is a 12-word limit when children are in that part of the brain. Everything after 12 words is the Charlie Brown, wah, 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 wah. So we teach families to use what we call drive-bys. So they're just short little phrases that you drop and walk. Okay, so for the child who's trying to be in control, who's the mom? Very simple, not a long lecture. And you can watch kids' eyes glaze over when they do that. The next thing is in that part of the brain, it is facial expressions, tone of voice, and gestures that children are interpreting, not what you're saying. So my children will frequently say to me, well, you yelled at me. I don't use never very frequently, but I can say I never yell. I am way too old and tired. I'm not a yeller. And so I'll say, did I raise my voice? And they'll say, no. But I do know that I have a mom look because my older boys have a whole comedy routine around the mom look that could control them across a room. So I have had to stand in front of the mirror and practice so that they don't perceive I'm yelling at them. But see, what we see often is we want to get into a debate with the child. I didn't yell at you. Yes, you did. Understanding where it comes from, you understand their perception is their reality, and I can do something constructive with it rather than getting trapped into the back and forth. Transition, or where we're going to see the majority of behaviors. The trauma-impacted child has a lot of autistic traits in the sense that they need a lot of warning and a lot of transition time. Okay? There is a diagnosis, and we'll talk more about this later, that is trauma-induced autism. So there are some similarities in what the behaviors look like, however, the roots are very different. These children have what I like to call hyperfocus, so they obsess on one thing at a time. So if this week I like peanut butter and jelly, that's what I want for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If this week I like Legos, I have my next 47 birthdays planned out in which set I need until I can move on to the next thing. It can also look like what we would call in the attachment world is incessant chatter, but it's not so much as all they can think about and talk about is that one thing. And so it cycles over and over again because they're hyper-focused on that particular thing. These children are very concrete. So if I say, buddy, how come you took my clicker to my computer off the table? I didn't take your clicker off the table. And I said, well, buddy, I watched you take my clicker off the table. I didn't take it off the table. Are you calling me a liar? Because he took it off the phone that was laying on the table. Not lying, concrete. If you don't get it, how it happened, it didn't happen. It's important in how we give children instructions, because with that concrete brain, they don't understand sarcasm. And so we can get ourselves into real trouble. And my husband learned this the hard way years ago when we had a little boy and he said, I don't like mashed potatoes. And my husband just flippantly said, fine, then just stick them in your ear. And he did. Very concrete. And so we have to be careful how we do it. They have what I call clogged filter syndrome. And what I mean by that is what we say and what is interpreted can often be worlds apart. So I'll give you an example. One of my girls had gotten arrested, quite frankly, so many times I don't remember what this time was, but she was court ordered into traditional therapy, and we don't use traditional therapy as a family because it's not effective with this population. We use TBRI and attachment focus. But anyway, she was ordered into traditional talk therapy. And so we went to the office and she walked in and she said, my mom said I ruined their lives. To which the therapist said, does your mom verbally abuse you like that often? And I wasn't there, but my husband was. And he said, well, time out. I don't know what was said because I wasn't there, but I'm guessing the context is a little different. So let's call and find out. So she called me and she said, I need to know why you verbally abuse your daughter. Nice to meet you too. Could you please tell me what I said? And I'm happy to address it. And so she did. And I said, oh. And I said, my daughter's there with you, right? And she said, yes. I said, okay, let me talk directly to her. And I said, sweetheart, I believe with everything in me that you heard me say that you've ruined our lives. But baby, I got to clear something up for you. I said, sweetheart, you don't have enough power to ruin my life, and I'm never going to give you that much power. So let me tell you what I did say, and then maybe you and your therapist can work on it. What I did say was the day you became mine, my job was to keep you safe, and I am going to do that job to the best of my ability till I take my last breath. But gosh, you're making that hard. You're taking off, sometimes for 2 weeks at a time. You're 14 years old. You have a phone. Would you just text me? And I stopped and the therapist went, oh. But think about it. When we don't understand trauma, think about the damage she did because she accused me of verbally abusing my child because she hadn't learned to see through the lens of trauma and eroded the most important relationship for our kids, which is that primary caregiver relationship. So again, clogged filter. And again, perception's reality. So be careful. And then physical symptoms. So there are nerves that run directly from the limbic part of the brain into the gut. So we see a lot of gut issues. And then finally, there's what we call the 20-second delay. So from the time you tell a trauma-impacted brain something till it hits the processing center of their brain, so from their ears to the processing center, takes 20 seconds. That's a really long time. So I was out at a home and there was a 4-year-old, and their big family rule was no feet on the couch. Now, for those of you who know me, I laughed because my big family rule is no sex in the front yard in the middle of the day. And yes, that is what my kids do. So I'm thinking I would love to have no feet on the couch as my biggest, most important rule. But that was their rule. And so she said to her little girl, "Get your feet off the couch. You know our rule." And the child appeared to ignore her. And mom went to say, "What? What do moms say? Did you hear me? I said, get your feet off the couch," but I stopped her and I started to count. And I got to 15, her feet were off the couch and she was on her way. So we have to not interrupt it, but 20 seconds, 70 to 80% of the time, the child will do whatever we asked them to do, even if it appeared up front like one of two things. One, ignoring or not hearing us, or two, it can look like opposition because my ears heard you, but it hasn't reached my process center, so I haven't processed it yet, and so I'm not ready to commit, so I'm going to give you my automatic refusal. But again, 70 to 80% of the time, if you do nothing for 20 seconds, it will get done. There's also a developmental impact to trauma, and again, this is critical in helping us develop our lens for working with this population. And development happens in a quad: physical, intellectual, social, and emotional. Physical and intellectual develop on the same trajectory, and social and emotional develop on the same trajectory. And any child who has experienced the risk factors we talked about, we can safely and conservatively half their social emotional age. Now, sometimes this is hard to do because they look grown. They look like a 15-year-old hairy-legged, mustache-growing boy, right? But when they get a no, will throw themselves on the floor and pound their fists and growl, right? Now, a lot of us come from backgrounds or organizations that would identify that as a mental health issue. But isn't that what 2-year-olds do? So maybe if I come parent the 2-year-old, one of my girls was 16 when she moved in. We were her 7th adoptive home. She was adopted 6 times prior to us. I know why. But because I parented her, but I'm just more stubborn than any of those other parents. But when she first came, if she didn't get what she wanted, she would throw herself on my kitchen floor and have a feet-kicking, arm-flailing temper tantrum. And again, you look and you want to say, "Get your grown self up off that floor." But instead, I would slide down on the floor like I would with a toddler, and I would just sit behind her and rock. Didn't say anything, didn't do anything. I would just rock. She had beat up every female caregiver that she had ever lived with and had been in foster care since she was 4. I'm sorry, 2. Her sister had been in since she was 2. And she never hit me. And someone said, "Oh, that's because you're a good mom." No, that's not what it is. What it is I think I was the first mom to see the 2-year-old that never had the 2-year-old needs met, and to go back and take care of that 2-year-old and nurture that 2-year-old and help her move forward. But again, when we have a smart kid who looks their age, it's hard to remember they might be really little socially and emotionally. And some of their behaviors, even sexualized behaviors, may be normal, not acceptable, but developmentally normal for their social emotional age, right? 3-year-olds are interested in the human body, right? They want to see, they want to touch. That's how 3-year-olds are. We think it must be a child who's been sexually abused or is on their way to becoming a sex offender if we have an 8-year-old doing that, right? But is that 8-year-old really 8? So I'm not saying that we can't have 8-year-olds going around and asking everyone to see their private parts. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is if we understand the root, then we're going to deal with it differently, because I'm just going to give the bodies are private until, or whatever talk I would give my 3-year-old. Here's where we show our bodies. Here's where we don't show our bodies. Normalize it developmentally in our mind. Now, I'm not saying that we rule out maybe there was sexual abuse, maybe there were other things, but we forget to look through the lens of that developmental impact. So, building blocks of relationship. Many of you are probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but that was a little bit too complex for me, and I wanted to be able to give families a way to quickly check in with where they are. And so for years we've talked about attachment, and attachment is critical, so don't hear me saying that it's not. However, in that process, sometimes we forgot about safety. Safety has to be the foundation of everything, because if I don't feel safe, I can't connect with you or build attachment. So safety is the bottom building block, and as you just heard in that clip, it's what we call felt safety, which is not that we've provided a safe environment for the child and told them that they're safe. It's when the child's brain knows that they're safe. And that has different lengths of time, again, depending on children. Once we've established safety, then connecting or attaching can begin to happen. And once we have developed a connection, we can see some reciprocity in our relationships. And so how I deal with parents is they'll say, there's no give and take in our relationship. My child is all about them. They're egocentric, they're selfish, right? But I'll say, well, then we're having a problem with connecting, so let's go back down there. Or if someone says, I'm just not connecting with my child, okay, there's something missing in safety. Let's go back and look for what's happening that has triggered that child not feeling. I watched last night 2 internationally adopted children, and the family's really struggling with the younger one who's 9. And I was out there last night, and all of their frustrations were up at the top of this building block of relationship. And I wanted to bring them back down here. And that's hard sometimes for families to see and to understand, or even biological families, to understand that sometimes there are just things that interrupt the building of safety in relationships. And for instance, let's use domestic violence. Okay? Let's say it's a male and a female. Okay, the female is the victim, but the child's trust is impacted by both people, right? Because it happened in the home, it was traumatizing. In the child's mind, mom can't even keep herself safe, so how can she keep me safe? Okay? So again, it's not mom's fault in the sense that it's never a woman's fault to get hit. It's never anyone's fault. But when we make choices that keep us in those types of relationships, it erodes our relationship with children. So again, safety, connection, and reciprocity. So what are the needs of children? The first is safety. We have to restore felt safety. The second is physical care, need meeting, recognizing precursors such as hunger, sensory overload, fatigue, unexpected changes. It's what we call being attuned to your child. Have you ever stood behind a pregnant lady in the grocery store? right? This is what she's doing, or in church. And, you know, we're pregnant and I'm rubbing my belly and I go home and my husband would say, "Hi, baby, how you doing?" and rub my belly. And baby was born and life was wonderful. But let's take an example of a mom who's in adverse circumstances herself, and she's not even sure how she feels about getting pregnant, and there's none of this going on. And when she gets home, she just hears, "Why did you let this happen again?" Because I guess his penis wasn't present or participating in the event. But now all of a sudden, you know, Mr. Prince Charming is screaming at me every time I come home. So my stress levels are way up. And all that stress hormone is pumping into the right side of baby's brain development. And let's say baby is removed at birth and handed directly into the arms of adoptive parent, foster parent, grandma, whoever it is. And they do this, and the baby's like, "What's that? I've never felt any of that." And so they are not attuned. And so we have to learn to be attuned. What is my child thinking? Attachment and connection to others is a need of children, and authenticity or connection to self. So felt safety is when adults arrange the environment and adjust their behavior so children can feel in a profound and basic way that they are truly safe in their home and with us. Because when we provide an environment of felt safety, it's disarming that primitive brain. And that's how we have to help children grow and heal. A child needs physical care, and they need a primary caregiver who consistently demonstrates that they can keep them safe and meet their needs. That's how trust develops. It's called the cycle of need. There's a need, an expression of the need, which is generally a behavior, a fulfillment of the need, and we achieve relaxation and we start it over again. So baby is hungry. How does baby express the need? They cry. How do we intervene? We feed the baby, right? They relax, and then we're on to the next diaper change or whatever the next need is. But think about it. We do that hundreds and hundreds of times a day in meeting needs for children. And so they know that the next time they're hungry, I'm there. But what about a child who was hungry and they cried, but they got ignored because mom had been using all night and she was passed out on the couch? Or they're hungry and they cry, but dad hits them in the face and tells them to shut up. He doesn't want to listen to the noise. Do they achieve relaxation? No. We've interrupted that cycle, and so instead distrust forms, and we have to go back to doing that cycle consistently over and over and over. So trust is the foundation of attachment. Now let me clarify that attachment is a word that is reserved for a primary caregiver. So therapists don't need to be attached. Teachers don't need to be attached. Social workers don't need to be attached. That is a term reserved for a primary caregiver. Children need to be attached to a primary caregiver. And that critical age for attachment is between 6 and 18 months of age. And here's the intriguing thing research shows. If a secure attachment is formed between 6 and 18 months of age, whoever it is formed with, that will never be replicated with anyone else. They may be able to reattach, maybe, but it will never be the same as that first attachment. So what does that say to us? We have to pay special attention to those ages to make sure that if a baby is home, where they are going to be permanently, that we are working with that parent on how to attach and the behaviors that are important. But if they have been somewhere else for that time period, we must pause and understand the gravity of making decisions to move that child around or to change placements in between those times. That's a very fundamental time. And the parent-child attachment is foundational for all future adaptive functioning. I parent 4 children who have no attachments to anyone or anything. And I often wonder, what would it have been like if I had them when they were like this? And I could have done this and done this, done all that need meeting, and they could have an attachment because they are not functional in any arena of their life. It forever impacts kiddos. There are things we can do. But once we have broken those attachments too many times, some children can't get it back. And that has to be sobering to those of us who are involved in making decisions for children's lives. So we're going to go a lot more into these attachment styles later, so I'm just going to introduce us to them there. But there are 4 attachment styles: secure, anxious, avoidant dismissive, and avoidant fearful. So avoidant can also be called anxious, an anxious attachment. Avoidant can be called dismissive or anxious avoidant in children, and anxious can be preoccupied or anxious ambivalent in children. And avoidant fearful is what we often call disorganized. Those look differently, and again, we're going to go into the specifics in a little bit. So we talked about the authenticity that a child needed to be safe, but they also need a connection to themselves. So how do we know if a child has reached that authenticity? They can form relationships grounded in real connection. They can stand up for themselves and others. They have a voice, even in the face of peer pressure. When 7 years ago, we adopted a sibling group of 9. 5 joined our family and 4 were adopted by my son and daughter-in-law. And 3 of our children, unknown to us when they moved in, but they were highly sexualized and violent. And we had a 5-year-old at the time. And one day, one of the boys named his penis and said to my 5-year-old, "This is Mr. Bob. If you pet him, he'll grow, and if he grows, he'll come to visit." And we were watching because we have cameras, and she put her hands on her hips and she said, "That's disgusting. In our house, we call that bad touch," and I'm using my words to tell my mom and dad. That's an authentic child who is connected to herself, that regardless of older children trying to engage her in something, she was able to use her voice to stand up for herself. Taking advantage of their gifts and talents and having self-confidence, creativity, and self-expression. Those are all indicators that a child has that authenticity. They are connected to who they are. Now, of course, there are personality differences and how that's applied. But when we think about the population we're really focusing on today, most kids, they don't know who they are. They don't have a connection to themselves. They are whatever they think they need to be to survive in that particular moment. The goal of parenting is to have an autonomous human being that is safe, respectful, connected, and authentic. Now let me just start introducing the idea that if the goal of parenting is to have an autonomous human being that is safe, respectful, connected, and authentic, are we going to achieve that by simply doing behavior management? Okay, I want you to think about people in your life. If my husband says to me, "Hey, I have a concern I want to share with you," I will listen to almost anything he has to say. I did have to qualify it a little. I will listen to him. Why? Because we have a relationship. I trust him. I have been with him longer than anyone else in my life except my siblings. If a stranger walks up to me and says, I want to tell you something about yourself that you need to work on, I don't really care what they have to say, right? Because I'm not connected to them. I don't know that they have my best interest at heart. It may just be about what they want. So I'm just trying to give you and to introduce that relationship is really the core of all of this. When I trust, I am relaxed, and I use that word in this sense. I can hear things. I can internalize what I need to and reject what I don't need to. But if I don't know the distinction and I'm not connected to myself, I will be whoever you need me to be in that moment, because I am about surviving, and surviving means I look like those around me in the pack. So discipline is simply a tool to strengthen the parent-child relationship. Discipline means what? It means to teach. It doesn't mean to give consequences. It doesn't mean to punish. It doesn't mean to yell at. It means to teach. So the most important question to ask when a child is exhibiting behaviors is, how can I best teach the lesson that needs to be learned? Not how can I obliterate the behavior, but how can I meet the underlying need, because behavior is an expression of an unmet need. How can I identify the need, meet the need, and teach what needs to be taught in a way that is helpful and healing? So let's look at punishment or created consequences and why they're not effective. Remember, the population we're talking about is living in the survival part of their brain, not that front part of the brain. Some people call it the upstairs and downstairs brain. But the upstairs is cause and effect, logic, reasoning. So let's think about it. Let's say that a parent opts to spank their child. And of course, we don't promote that as healthy parenting, but it serves as a good example in this case. What is the point in a spanking? Why do parents spank? Why did a lot of us grow up where that was the preferred method of discipline? Why do parents spank? What are we hoping for? Ouch, that hurts. I'm not going to do that again because ouch, that hurts, right? But our kids aren't using that part of their brain. So let's think about taking something away. I had a principal at a school say to me, because we had a child who was in foster care, and he was a little challenging at school. Well, he was a little challenging everywhere, but he had been through unspeakable trauma. He had been beat by his father so significantly that the bruises took weeks to heal. Dad took off and absconded when law enforcement was called with him in the car. So he was in a police chase and watched Dad get taken to the ground forcefully and put in handcuffs and then brought to a stranger's house. That is not a good day for a child. And so we weren't surprised when he acted out at school, but the school was surprised because he should be grateful that he's somewhere safe. So anyway, she said, well, what do you do to punish him when he comes home and he's been in trouble at school? And I said, ma'am, I told you we don't punish at our house. Well, I mean, what consequences do you give him? And I said, ma'am, I don't. And she said, what do you do? I said, we make a big deal when he has a good day. And every day on the way to school, we talk about what friend behavior looks like and what respect looks like. And she said, I don't understand that. And I said, well, ma'am, for the sake of conversation, let me bring up a couple things. Let's say that I decide to spank him because he acts out in school. How hard do you think I would have to hit him for it to be any different than what he's experienced in the past? I would have to beat him, probably almost to death. And I said, so instead, maybe I'll take away his Nintendo Switch. Oh, I bet that'll work because he's lost his mom, his dad, his neighborhood, his aunties, his friends, the foods he was used to eating, the bed he used to sleep in, the familiar sights, sounds. Oh yeah, taking away his Game Boy or his Nintendo Switch will probably make a big difference. And she said, okay, I get your point. So again, when we spend our time creating consequences for this population, it's not conducive to learning because it puts me in a space of not what you're doing for me, but what you're doing to me. And now I am solidly back in survival mode. So again, how can I best teach the lesson that needs to be learned? And we'll talk a little more, but I'll give you a couple examples because we do utilize natural consequences, right? Because life has natural consequences. So if a child is in a rage and they break their toy, I don't run out and buy them a new toy. That's the natural consequence. I broke my toy. But we can get creative with it. I was working with a 14-year-old boy and I pulled up in their driveway for the session and Mom met me out at the car and she handed me his iPhone and said, I told him it's up to you if he gets this back tonight. And I said, whoa, time out. I'm not the mom. But because you set me up, I'll handle it tonight. So we went in and sat down and I said, buddy, tell me what happened. He said, I was outside skateboarding with my friends and Mom called me for dinner and I wasn't done playing and she kept calling me and I screamed at her and told her to quit nagging me and I took my skateboard and I threw it into the garage and it hit the wall. And he said, and then she said, give me your phone. So I threw that at her too. And I said, Mom, give him his phone back. And she looked at me because that was not what she was expecting. And I said, what does the phone have to do with the behavior where we started? And he was now looking large and in charge and happy. And I said, oh, buddy, don't get too happy yet because we're going to start this process over and do it differently. So I said, Mom, when he threw the skateboard in the garage and hit the wall, you pick up the skateboard and say, oh, buddy, not safe. That could really hurt someone. I'm going to hang on to your skateboard till we can come up with a plan for how you're going to use it safely. And I said, do you go to Dad's this weekend? It was a divorce situation. And he said, yeah. I said, okay, I'm going to call Dad because I had a relationship with Dad as well. I'm going to call Dad and here's the deal of what's going to happen Saturday morning. Mom's going to get you up at 7. You're going to go to Home Depot and buy a can of paint. And you're going to come home and see the scratch you put on the wall from the skateboard hitting it. I said, we can't just paint over the scratch because it won't match the rest of the paint. So you're going to paint that wall. And Mom can help you because she's willing to. And then when that's done, Dad can come pick you up and you can be on for the weekend. So do you see how that facilitates learning better than taking away, right? Because if I say to my child, don't walk across the floor with muddy shoes, and they do it anyway, and I send them to their room, what does that teach them? No, I'm going to hand them a mop. I want them to understand the reason I don't want you walking across my wet floor is because it makes mud. And then it takes me a long time to clean it up. We had a little boy named Matthew in foster care. He was 5, and when he came to me, he had open wounds from his waist to his ankles from being beat with an extension cord by his mom's boyfriend. And when the case manager dropped him off, she looked at me and she said, just so you know, he's a liar. And I thought, well, that's a very kind thing to say about a 5-year-old little boy. And she was right. He lied about everything. He was in trouble all day at school because he lied about everything, even inconsequential things. But I learned early in our process of working with these kiddos that I would rather do nothing and wait till I knew what to do than to do something damaging and have to repair it. And so I waited, and I prayed, and I waited, and I prayed, and about 2 weeks in, I got it. And I squatted down, and I said, buddy, can I have your hands? Can I have your eyes? I said, I figured something out today. I want to tell you how proud I am of you for being such a good liar. And he looked at me, shocked, because he was in trouble every day at school. And I said, here's what I figured out. Because you're such a good liar, it kept you alive. And because you were alive, you got to come live with me, and that's awesome. And that was all I said. And then we began to build on that, how he no longer needed that survival skill because that wasn't going to happen at my house. And in about 6 weeks, his lying was gone because he established the felt safety we're talking about. So I came up with this saying that we cannot extinguish a behavior until we have validated its usefulness. Survival behaviors serve a purpose. And until we validate that the children we work with need that behavior, we can't move on. By the same token, we must be very, very careful. And this is why I often say, I don't believe that intense trauma work can be done until a child has permanence. Because intense trauma work is removing those survival skills and replacing them with healthy ones. But if they're going somewhere else, they may need their survival skills, and we're not serving them well to take them away from them. So let's reframe perspective. So any parenting practice that focuses on behavior without addressing the underlying emotional dynamics or the purpose of the behavior is going to be harmful to the child. So what is the focus? Long-term developmental progress. The behavior it's a developmental process, right? And that's why we also have to understand through the eyes of child development, what are typical stages? What might be normal behavior for a 4-year-old that we're seeing in a 9-year-old, so we think it's pathological, but it may not be. It may just be 4-year-old behavior because that's where they are emotionally. But it's a developmental process. It's not always a choice, and it's not necessarily a disease that we have to medicate. We pathologize so many things in our work with children, whether it be a school, the child welfare system, the therapeutic environment, and I understand that we need diagnoses to bill insurance, which is why, and we'll talk more about this, there are certain diagnoses that I really like because they can go away and they don't label a child. It is not a mentally ill child. It is a child who, because of their complex trauma, their brain has been impacted and their neurochemicals are way out of whack and they did nothing to cause it. So the commitment is always to the child, not to the outcomes. A lot of families put their child in therapy because they want their child fixed. And when I had to say to a family last week, your child doesn't need to be fixed, you do. Yep. They actually rescheduled another time to come back, so I guess I didn't offend them too bad. But the thing is, and Dr. Purvis with TBRI will always say it's 90% parental or caregiver change, 10% kiddos adjustment. We have to look through a different lens and reframe perspective. Children who have well-developed survival skills should be applauded. They're strong kids. They knew how to survive. And so we have to start there and then very gently remove those from them when they don't need them anymore, because they're not so cute as they continue. So here we're going to talk a little bit about diagnosing. And I just want to stress that the mental health community really needs to allow time for healing when we're dealing with kiddos. Because if kiddos are coming in for that first intake, rather than immediately pathologizing their behaviors, we have to understand where the child has come from, what their experiences have been, and we need to pay special attention when we can to the in utero and first year experience, as well as things after that. But that's the foundation. because a lot of trauma symptoms look like mental health diagnoses. But the difference is when we have healings, those symptoms diminish. So for example, autism. That now seems to be the ADHD diagnosis of 15 years ago, where it's just the catch-all. If I don't know what to diagnose you, it's going to be autism, which isn't terrible because it provides access to a lot of services. However, do we ever think long-term? And what if that child experiences healing from their trauma and they want to go into the military? Can't do it with a diagnosis of autism. What if they want to go into, a field where it takes it away from them, and once again, a child who is in a situation they never asked to be in is now still being penalized for what someone else did to them, not what they did. So I'm just encouraging us to be careful. There is a trauma-induced autism that is a more recent diagnosis, and the reason I like that one is it qualifies kids for the same services as a straight autism diagnosis, but it lays the foundation that can be removed. If the trauma is mitigated, that diagnosis can be removed. It won't follow them the rest of their life. Now, I'm not saying if it's truly autism, don't give them the diagnosis. Do you hear what I'm saying, though? We have to take our time to know what it is. So can we give lesser diagnoses to satisfy what insurance needs? I love adjustment disorder. And people say, well, yeah, but we can only use it for 3 months. Well, in the life of our population, you can guarantee there's something that has happened to reinstitute that diagnosis, and it can be dragged on for a while until we have figured out what's really going on. Is it ADHD or is it hypervigilance? Is it anxiety that comes from a genetic predetermination, or is it anxiety because you've placed me in a new situation that I know nothing about, and it would be silly of me not to be anxious, right? What if I said to all of you in this room and online today, I said, while you have sat in this training today, I have made an executive decision and none of you are returning to your homes. You are going to be swapping partners with other people in the room. And so, Sarah, you will be going to my house and you can have my husband. And I guess I'll go to yours, except you have some boys. I don't know if I want to go there. So, we're going to switch you all around. How many of you are going to go, sure, Lauren? We get it. That's really cool. But if I say you have no choice and you go home and say Sarah has to come to my house and so she's assigned my husband and my children, you'd have it worse than me going to your house. But if she said after 24 hours, oh, I love this man. I really trust him. And then a week from now, I'm going to do it again. We're going to do fruit basket turnover and you're going to someone else's house. And Sarah says, oh, I love him. I can trust him. What are we going to say about Sarah? She's a hoe. She's mentally ill, right? That's not normal behavior. But we pathologize it in children when that's exactly what they're doing with them. They're raised with the message in school, don't talk to strangers, but I'm going to send you home with a stranger and I'm going to expect you to love them and let them do intimate things with you, like help change your clothes and give you a bath. And you're supposed to just trust them. And when we see those resistant behaviors, we tend to pathologize it. And so I'm just saying we have to become very careful to see things through the lens of trauma and take our time in looking at diagnoses. Okay? The last one on this list is it bipolar disorder or is it disorganized attachment and very well-developed survival skills? For a while, reactive attachment disorder was kind of the also hot topic for the adoption community, but it was so misdiagnosed because a true reactive attachment disorder child, according to the diagnostic criteria, is going to present as an autistic child. But they were utilizing it for aggressive, defiant kiddos, which falls much more under disorganized attachment. So I know that's being reworked in the DSM, but I'm just saying diagnosing mental health issues is very subjective. And so when we're doing that, I hope we never lose the grave responsibility it is that we hold someone else's life in our hands, and the diagnosis we give them could potentially follow them the rest of their life, so we better be right. And if we don't know, it's okay to pause, because there are very vague, more broad diagnoses that we can use until we know. Anyone else have some example? Go ahead, Teresa.
So someone did ask a question.
Okay.
Stanton. She said, I find that a lot of kids are being overdiagnosed when what is going on is the manifestations of their various trauma. But trauma diagnosis that does not fall under OHI or IEP or 504 purposes for school. Do you have any suggestions for school plans and services in these cases?
Okay. So I'm going to answer that twofold. Do we have any plan? I think on one side, we need to work with school systems to understand, because the reality is trauma has increased since the onset of COVID. Trauma in our standard population has increased greatly. Schools are seeing more and more trauma behaviors. So the school needs to understand and looking at expanding some of the criteria. However, as far as diagnoses, trauma-induced autism, I think ADHD is an okay diagnosis as long as the people treating it understand. That's one that I don't think would cause lifelong issues. But I'm saying just be very careful in what diagnoses we're using so that it's not risking a child's future. And I'll give you an example. One of my sons had the highest levels of cocaine and alcohol they had ever registered in a newborn, almost died multiple times in infancy. And by the time he was 5, he had all sorts of diagnoses. When the trauma was healed, he went into the Air Force, but it was a fight to get him in. And that was his dream, but it was a fight because he had some crazy diagnoses that he had been given over the years. And fortunately, we were able to make a good case for, they've been mitigated and there had been no symptoms since he was 6 or 7 years old, other than ADHD, which to this day he's 30 and he still has raging ADHD. I can have him visit me for about 15 minutes before I need a break and then come back. But you hear my point. It could have interfered. And if he didn't have parents that understand systems and are willing to fight, it may have devastated a dream for a child. So would you ask in the chat if that answered the question? So in connecting with schools, I just think it's finding the proper criteria without permanence. Teresa? Did that answer their question?
I believe so.
Okay, so we're going to move now into TBRI specific principles. A child whose behavior pushes you away is a child who needs connection before anything else. Okay. So TBRI, here are the beginning. The interactions must be proactive and responsive. I am going to anticipate needs before the child even has a chance to have a meltdown, right? That allows connection. So some of the parenting philosophies that have gone around in the last probably 10, 15 years, but there is a faith-based version and the same version, but not faith-based, and it's Growing Kids God's Way, and does anyone know the other? It's the same method. But anyway, it is really teaching, you let a baby cry it out. You teach them to cry it out, soothe themselves. It's all about controlling for the parent's convenience, right? Sleep training. And again, I'm not opposed to children sleeping through the night. I appreciate that. What I'm saying, though, is that when we're talking about children impacted by early trauma, I need to feed them before they're hungry. Because what am I saying to that child's brain? I can keep you safe and meet your needs. I can keep you safe and meet your needs. I can keep you safe and meet your needs. And the cycle of need is fulfilled. So proactive and responsive interactions. Connecting principles and correcting principles, we're going to go into what exactly that is. So here are the levels of response in TBR. Level 1 is playful engagement. If Carolyn, is that right, Carolyn? If Carolyn has a baby sitting in her lap, I don't walk in and say, "Hi, you're a cute baby. I'm glad you came with your mom to the training today." Right? I go, "Hi, baby." I slow my cadence. I animate my face. Why? I want a smile from that baby. I want that baby's brain to say, "This lady's safe." Okay? So we know that is a normal developmental stage that most of the kids we serve miss. And so we use playful engagement with them. I have worked with kids in juvie there for some pretty violent crimes, and I've never had a kid come after me, and people say, "Oh, you must be really good," and again I say, "No, I'm really not, but I am playful. I play with them a lot." What does that look like without being condescending? So let me give you a couple examples. You may not talk to me disrespectfully. Try again with respect. Do you see? The playful tone is entirely different, but I said the same thing. Playful engagement. We want to stay at playful engagement as long as we possibly can. Level 2 is structured engagement. You have two choices. You may sit in the think about it chair for 3 minutes to calm down, or you may come sit with me and I'll help you calm down. Structure. No more than two choices. So I was honored and blessed to call Dr. Purvis a friend, not just someone whose book I read. And we had a debate around the topic because she felt so strongly about two choices because children need a voice. And I don't disagree, but the debate we had was this. And I said, here's where I get stuck. When I have a newborn, I don't go in their room in the morning and say, "Morning, sweetheart, do you want breast milk or formula today? Do you want to wear a sleepy or a onesie?" I get them dressed, I feed them what I feed them, and that tells them they're safe, that I will keep them safe and meet their needs. When children have missed that critical developmental stage, we may need to actually go back to no choices to reestablish that for a brief amount of time. And she agreed from that perspective. And so I've actually done that with a few kids and just have, and I've said to them, because they're old enough to understand, "Buddy, for whatever reason your brain is not telling you that mom and dad are the boss because they can keep you safe and meet your needs. So we're going to do an experiment. And for the next 3 weeks, no choices. Mom's going to pick out what you wear, what you eat, what you get to read, what you get to watch on TV, just till your brain figures out that they can keep you safe and meet your needs. And then we'll go back to 2 choices. And it's actually been effective. I don't do it a lot because I think it's reserved for kids that we really know miss that critical stage of development, but it seems to be effective. But again, structured engagement, calming engagement. And then level 4 is protective engagement. So that would be where we may have to use some kind of a restraint, not a forceful restraint, but a restraint. But then we return right to playful engagement. Okay, so let's talk about the connecting principles. Matching behavior. Think about when you have a baby or you've watched a family member with a newborn, and we hold them like this and we make eye contact and they make a sound and we make the same sound back to them, right? We're matching their behavior. That occurs automatically. It is in us. It's intuitive. When a baby smiles, we smile back at them. It's all that matching behavior that says, what does that do? It builds trust and connection. We're attuned to each other. What's interesting is if you look at MRIs during those interactions, there are just synapses firing everywhere. So it doesn't just create the right environment for the child, it is actually impacting their brain. It is allowing them to develop. So if a child's playing on the floor with blocks, I can stand up here and talk to them, or I can sit on the floor and play with them and match their behavior, and we have a connection that's going to stimulate growth and development. Okay? That builds trust. Voice. We have to be aware of the tone and cadence of our voice. It makes such a huge difference. When I was with Mom last night and the younger sibling was crying, and Mom was just irritated because she was crying because she was mad, not because she was sad. And I could tell Mom was just irritated. But when Mom's irritated, she withdraws physical proximity and affection. And I thought to myself, I get how easy that is when you have hard kids. By the same token, when does a child need it the most, right? When they're trying to do that. But I listened to her talk to her, and it was in this disgusted tone. I heard disgust. If I heard disgust, how do you think the child heard that? Right? Just frustration with the behavior. So we want parents to adjust, or caregivers adjust. We kind of want them to use a voice that's sweet and slightly higher pitched, because we know scientifically that that higher pitched voice is easier for little's ears to hear. And we want a cadence that's more swift and melodic. At times, we might have to transfer to a firm voice, but it's not a harsh, sarcastic, or loud voice. I worked with maximum security male inmates at the Pinellas County Jail for several years, and I remember drug treatment at that time, the philosophy was that you had these groups where you would put someone in the middle and everyone would scream at them and berate them, and that was supposed to help addicts break the cycle. And I was really young, and even then I realized that's really dumb. You bring people in who are using because they have no self-esteem, and you rip their self-esteem down. I didn't understand that. So that was not my approach. And one day the guy said to me, "We've given you a nickname." And I said, "Okay." And they said, "The Cobra." And I said, "Okay, can you explain what that means?" And they said, "You talk so nice and so sweet, and then you come out with a zinger, but you say it in that nice, sweet tone." And I thought, okay, I like that. But that's what I'm talking about. When we're connecting principles, at times we have to go to another level because there are behaviors that are unsafe, disrespectful, whatever they may be. And we can do that and use a firm voice, but we don't change the tone and cadence. Okay, we've touched on playful engagement, but let's go just a little bit more. And when we're engaging, again, play removes fear. Play limits fight, and freeze reactions. Right? Can you relate to that? I mean, think about interactions with people. Are people who are more playful and not authoritative easier for you to listen to? They are for me. It's probably why I'm okay with having some hard kids, because I don't like to be told what to do either. So I can appreciate where they come from. But we want playfulness as much as we can. When we have to move to the next level, we still want to go back. We want to complete a cycle and go back to that playful engagement. When the little boy I told you about the other night was raging and destroying stuff in his room, I just sat on the floor in a corner where I wasn't going to get hit by a flying object or, hurt. I'm not stupid. And then when we got done, or when he got down enough that I could say, "Oh, buddy, not safe. Let's be safe. And then I'm here." But we ended with a very playful interaction. That's hard for people to do because our culture is very punitive based. In order to change a behavior, I must punish consequence. And so I have a hard time being playful. Like I said, this mom last night, well, she was just rude to me. Why would I want to give her a hug? Because the two things aren't connected. So when I go back to the playfulness, I'm saying to the child, I love you, not based on how you perform for me, but I love you, but we will address the problems. Do you see that balance? We want structure and nurture. So if a parent leads, they tend to lead with structure. You can't go anywhere until that parent brings up nurture to meet the level of the structure. Conversely, if a parent leads with nurture, they can't go anywhere till they bring structure up to meet it, because kids need nurture to connect. They need structure to grow. Structure allows all of us, but particularly children, to feel safe. Predictability builds security. Eye contact, very important. Fact, a newborn's scope of vision is from the crook of mom's arm to her eyes. When mom and baby make eye contact, now think about it, the breast is also located there, so I'm meeting needs, making eye contact, and when I do, baby's brain releases serotonin, the master regulator of the brain. Here's the really cool part. Mom's brain gets a burst of serotonin as well. So the bond that is biological and begins in utero is solidified in attachment outside through that process. Now, an aside, let's step out of the world for trauma a moment and just look at our current day culture. And how many moms are sticking one of those little capes over them and they're breastfeeding, which is great for the baby, but they're doing it while they're pushing a grocery cart in the store, or they're sitting on the couch going through their phone, and there's none of this gazing into baby's eyes. I wonder, is that why we have an increase in postpartum depression? Because mom's brain isn't getting the serotonin that she would get from connecting with her baby. Eye contact has a physical response in us. Now, I want to make a distinction though. I want children to make eye contact with me when they're regulated. If they're dysregulated and they're in that survival part of the brain, it's not going to serve a good purpose. It's going to be a threat. So I want to wait till we're calm. Although I have a granddaughter who is trauma impacted, and I hold her through tantrums. And I have always said to her, as soon as you can look at Grammy's eyes, we'll be done. Because I know that as soon as she makes eye contact, because we have a connection, she'll get that burst of cortisol and she'll regulate right away. I am the on-site therapist for a camp for trauma-impacted kids in the summer, and last summer we had a little boy that I had worked with outside the camp as well, and he was having a rage over something, and so I got called to go intervene with him, and he flipped around and he said to me, "Go away, Miss Lauren, I am not looking at your eyes, and I don't want you to regulate me." And I thought, well, at least he knows what's going on, right? But that was not the time to, say, "Buddy, I really need your eyes." It was the time to let that burn out and then go back. Connecting principles, safe touch. Consistent and affectionate touch is important for any connection between parent and child. Safe touch and nurture stimulates pleasure receptors in the brain, and it can also curb stress hormones like cortisol. Think about it from a sensory perspective too. It can really help children calm. Touch calms. If you think of behavior in terms of red, yellow, and green, well, let me back that up. Green, yellow, and red. I flipped it. Green is good. Everything's going great. Yellow, starting to go south. Red, I'm off the chain. As a rule of thumb, once I'm in red, it has to burn itself out. So nothing will work. We just wait for it to burn itself out. So the key is getting a lot of these principles activated in the yellow so we can go back to green. But because we know senses are often on overload, that touch will calm. My point is it will calm when we're in yellow. It may not calm at all. It may totally irritate in red. But what's considered safe depends on the child. If I am not a parent or caregiver and working with the child, in our model, we almost always have parents present or caregivers present when we're working with them, but hands are very safe, right? Give me your hands, hand to hand, safe touch, pat on the shoulder, maybe a little squeeze if they need some sensory input. That's all safe touch. And we want to know enough about the child to know what would be unsafe touch for them while meeting needs. So connected discipline versus distancing discipline. So here are just some suggestions. Instead of time out, we're going to do time in, right? Because time out says, I don't want you near me. How is that facilitating connection? Time out says, I only love you if you're complying with what I ask of you. Time in says, I value you. I want to help. I want to meet your needs. Sending a child to their room or away versus bringing a child close. Buddy, you're having such a hard time being nice to your sister, so you're just going to hang with mom for a while so I can make sure everyone's safe. That's different than go to your room until you can be nice. Because again, in isolation, children need external regulation before they learn internal regulation. So being in my presence and my allowing them, helping them to regulate is going to achieve the desired goals much more quickly than if I'm triggering abandonment and rejection and all those things that happen from being sent away. I do a lot in schools, and that's probably one of the more challenging environments for them to get. We don't have to punish. Consequences versus resolution. The standard at my house is, what did I do wrong? What can I do differently next time? And if you get those, we're good. We're done. We're on, we move on. Now, if you do the same thing 47 times, we may have to have a different conversation. But if you can own it and we can resolve it, we're good. Problem solving as opposed to lectures and discourses. 3 of my girls were in trouble. They got brought home by the police for something. I don't remember. The police have a spare bedroom at my house, but they got brought home for some reason. And my husband said, I'm going to talk to the girls. Would you like to join me? And I said, no, thank you. And he said, what do you mean, no, thank you? And I said, honey, for the next hour, you're going to have the best conversation with them. You're going to talk to them about how we are the family that can help them be who God made them to be, and they're safe, and we love them. And yeah, and they're not using that part of their brain. After your first 12 words, they're going to cut you off anyway, and I got things to do. So he did it anyway. I said, have at it. I'm just not going to join you. And he came out and he said, what wall can I put my head through? I don't know why I keep doing that. And I said, I don't either, but hope springs eternal. Just please quit asking me to participate. Dads, particularly, I noticed, love to lecture. And you can just watch. I watch kids all the time, even, when I'm in the home and their eyes just glaze over after so many words. So solve the problem and move on. What do we need to do to solve it? And we're done. Advocacy as opposed to being an adversary. Have any of you in this room or online ever done anything wrong? I have. And I'm really grateful that when I do something wrong, the people in my life don't hate me and label me and view me poorly. Generally, they'll say, what can I do? How can I best support you? I think that's what we're supposed to do, but we have a hard time doing that with children because sometimes professionals and parents, caregivers, get their ego wrapped up in the child's progress as being they're responsible for it and it reflects on them. Not true. We can't change anybody. We can't fix anybody. We can provide the path. And we can hold someone's hand on that path, but ultimately they have to choose to walk with us. Connected discipline is focusing on the child's value as opposed to the distancing, focusing on their failures. Think about in a healthy family system, and I have my newborn, and that newborn has known for 9 months in utero how loved they are because I'm caressing them and talking to them and eating healthy and, all the things you do when you have a healthy pregnancy. And so when that baby's born and I sit and I gaze their eyes, what am I telling that baby? You're precious, you're valuable, you're wanted, you're desired. But in the absence of those, what are most of our kids internalizing? I'm a failure. I don't belong. No one wants me. So we want to focus. A child is valuable because they're a child. It is behaviors that are challenging, not the child. It is a child who struggles with mental health issues as a result of their trauma, not a mentally ill child. It is a child who has attachment struggles because of what was done to them, not a child who is defined by the diagnosis. A child is not the diagnosis. That describes a behavior. But the child is valuable and precious by the sole fact that they're alive, and most of them are amazing survivors. And I think if those around them validated what great survivors they are more often than not, we may see some things kick off a little more quickly and make a trajectory. But unfortunately, they're often told they are bad. Okay, so correcting principles. To be proactive, they are playful. We're using drive-bys. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Asked and answered. Ooh, try again with respect. Who's the boss? I am, because I can keep you safe. Need you to use your words, not your behaviors, to tell me what you need. You see all these little phrases that are short. Reminders. I did an intensive weekend with a family one time, and one day she had a 4-year-old, and one day we spent the entire day just out in the community learning how to walk across a parking lot without getting hit by a car, sitting in a restaurant and not losing your mind. We just practiced those things. But I left on a Sunday. Mom calls me Monday morning and says, he's in the car, he's kicking the windows out, he's doing all of this. And I said, okay, I'm on my way, I'll follow up. And as soon as I got there, and I opened the door, he looked at Mommy and he said, yes, Mommy, I will sit respectfully. And I just started laughing. But what we did is when we stopped, before he got out of the car, I opened the door and I said, remember, when I unhook your car seat, you're going to get down and take Mommy's hand. And then I would give him the next step after he did that, but just reminders. I'm not expecting him. I hear so many caregivers and parents say, well, they should know by now. It's never changed. The rule has never changed. But short-term memory's impacted. And I'm a kid. And I got a lot of things on my mind, like, when am I going to get to go home and see my mom? When am I going to have to see my mom? When am I, whatever it might be. So we want to give reminders, and we want to give prompts and cues. There is nothing wrong with giving children prompts and cues and letting them try again. Frequently, I will have parents who complain about lying with their children. I'll say, okay, time out. Here's what I want you to do. If you know they're lying, now let me go back. Remember, why did you take my clicker off the table? I didn't. That's not lying. That's concrete brain. Okay. But if I'm just flat out, I really am lying, and you know it, just look at them and say, ooh, want to try that again? A lot of times they'll self-correct. Another family I'm currently working with, that's their big complaint, is the 6-year-old lies. And I looked at Mom and Dad last time and I said, you know what, if I lived in your house, I would lie too. Because he's in trouble all the time. I said, so we got to work on you. That's the same parents. I said, no, he doesn't need to change, you do. But again, he's an amazing survivor. And give him some credit and have patience that his survival skills are going to take a little longer to go away because he needed them for a pretty long time. Responsive, I'm going to be connected. I'm going to be focused on what we're doing at the time. I'm going to be directive, and the goal is green. Now, these are both principles for parent caregiver or whoever is engaged. So it could be for a therapist, it could be for a teacher. The same principles apply, they're just going to look a little bit different. But I think one of the problems, and we're going to talk about therapy tomorrow, but one of the problems is that a lot of current therapy is aimed at, you have the answer within yourself and I just have to help you find it. Okay? I come from the perspective, you're paying me a lot of money to help you find an answer within yourself. I'm guessing you're paying me a lot of money because you have no idea what to do. So I'm going to be more directive, right? I'm going to be helpful. That's what I think we're talking about by directive. Here is next step. Here is what you can do. I'm not going to assume that a child's going to figure it out, because quite frankly, a lot of adults can't figure it out. And why do people go to therapy? Because we can't figure it out on our own. We need help. And the goal is always to go back to green. It's interesting. I told you we have adopted difficult children, but one of my children got arrested. He has been on the run and he got arrested in Texas this week. And how he got to Texas, I have no idea. But in talking to the probation officer out there, they have integrated TBRI into their whole juvenile justice system and use it in the facilities. And I think, wow, kids might actually get help because we're not just punishing them, we are looking at restoration of relationships and helping them. So the world of child welfare and trauma is a complex, challenging, trauma-impacted environment with fragile human beings all around us. It can be overwhelming, or it can be an opportunity. An opportunity to invest in others, to demonstrate grace, to see the best in everyone who interfaces with my day. Because in the midst of overwhelming emotion, overwhelming trauma, are overwhelming acts of compassion, commitment, and care. It's a place where healing happens, where relationships are cemented, and miracles are seen. You matter, your role matters, and you can make a difference. There is an old Indian proverb that I often tell the kids that I work with. And there was an elephant who wandered into an Eastern Indian village. And the elders couldn't agree on how to describe this massive being that came into their village. And they argued, and they finally said, let's get the 5 blind men and have them describe the elephant. So the first blind man felt the elephant's leg and said, oh, the elephant is like the mighty trees that stand in our forest. And the next one felt his side and said, oh, the elephant is like the walls that protect our village. And the next one felt his trunk and said, oh, the elephant is like the giant boa constrictors that slither through the grass. And the next one felt his ear and said, the elephant is like the fans we use to cool off in the summer. And then the last one felt his tail and said, the elephant is like the brooms we use to sweep out our huts. They were all right, but they were all wrong because no one had the full picture. And I think in this world, it is getting the full picture and having the capacity to shift perspective that allows us to be most effective in what we do. When I'm working with kids, I'll often tell them, sweetheart, you are standing behind the elephant's behind. And do you know what happens when you're standing behind the elephant's behind? But then as we're working, I can say to them, oh, you're behind the elephant's behind. I need you to come out. Because that's our work is shifting perspective. But if we as the professionals and those we help are not shifting our own perspectives, we run into trouble. And just because something is the way it's always been done does not mean it's right. Look at how many things in our culture that we used to think were okay. I became a foster parent in the 70s. At that time, they did not allow you to keep a child in your home longer than 3 months because they were afraid they would get attached to you, so they would move them to a new home. That was practice. We look at that now and think, that is so archaic and barbarian. We were damaging children. We were. But how many things do we do today that are going to fall in that category? And so we have to be able to come out of the box. And one of the things I do, I have 2 of my interns are here in the training, but I tell all the interns when we have supervision is that my goal with interns is not as much to expose you to a job, but to help you be a critical thinker. Because we have trends that we see in our fields, and we just kind of jump in and accept them. And I hope that we never jump in and accept them, because there are lives that we are impacting every day. So I want to spend some time talking about effective treatment modalities for children with complex trauma. Now, let me qualify first by saying this. The ones I list as not effective, I am not saying that they are not effective in any realm, okay? There are pieces of all of these that I have used and will continue to use. However, they are not effective in part with this population, and we'll talk about why. So I say not effective, and I'll use ABA as an example. ABA is based on the Skinnerian belief that we just change environment and that will help. One of their big premises is that we ignore junk behavior. Unfortunately, with the population we're talking about in significant trauma, ignoring means permission. So I can't ignore because the child is operating by a perception that has been formed by trauma, and so therefore is not an internal working system that's going to allow them to be successful. So I have to address things. It's how I address them that makes it healing or not healing, but to just ignore it is not going to work. It's actually going to increase it because it's not building that sense of felt safety, right? Because I'm not secure. It is through that balance of structure and nurture that I heal and feel secure and feel safe. And when you're ignoring my behaviors, I don't feel safe. Now, again, we can pin that down, and are there always some things we're going to ignore? Yes. But if it falls into a pattern that's unhealthy and is based in fear, we don't want to ignore it. Talk therapy. What does talk therapy rely on? Cause and effect, logic, reasoning, and you're right, talking. And I'm having to process way too many words because there's more than 12 words in talk therapy. And let me add that making talk therapy virtual and expecting children to have any positive impact is ludicrous. During COVID, we continued to go into homes and see kids, and there were some families who would say, well, can we do virtual? And I say, I will see any parent virtually. I will not see children virtually. Because, and the whole reason we went into homes and did not wear masks at the time was not because we were ignoring safety. It was because children who've experienced trauma need to be able to read my face. I wonder how many children we're seeing who were babies during COVID that because they didn't see faces now have regulation problems. You know, let's go back to what Jules said. It's relationship is at the core of everything. And when I have things that stand in the way, so talk therapy is relying on things that our kids can't provide and they're not going to benefit from. CBT can be okay, but it can also be very triggering, okay, because it is following, and I'm not going to go into detail because again, these therapies in and of themselves are not bad or ineffective in some areas. I use some CBT stuff. However, what is effective is when we're focusing on developmental progress and body-based techniques. So therefore, effective treatment is going to be high-paced. It's going to switch up because I'm recognizing that very short window of time to do things. So I'm going to engage social, emotional, physical, intellectual, all within that treatment modality. I'm going to focus on connection. That's why we do it with a parent or caregiver present. And I know this is going to come way outside traditional thought and probably offend someone, and that's okay. I offend people all the time, and I welcome you to challenge things. Don't sit and just accept it because I say it. I am totally okay and not offended by people challenging because I think that's how we learn, is when we have healthy debate. But at our agency, the philosophy that I have found it on is parents are the best therapists. They're there 24/7, right? Since when have kids scheduled their crises during business hours? And so we take a child that struggles with relationships, struggles with felt safety, struggles with connection, and we bring them into an office for an hour, which is not a very realistic environment, right? And I play with them or I talk to them or I do whatever I do with them. But if my goal is to work on underlying issues, I have now stirred things up and I get to 45 minutes and I say, thanks, see you next week. And I send them out to caregiver, put them in the car, and they tantrum all the way home. And caregiver has no idea why, because no one's filled them in. Or it could be like my girls, who, two of my girls grew up in, they were in foster care from the ages of 2 and 5 and were 15 and 16 when we adopted them, different times, but they were 15 and 16, and had been in group homes most of their life, and they hated therapy. And so they would get together and create these amazing things that had happened to them that they could talk about in therapy. And so when we were going through the adoption process, and I knew the girls because I worked in dependency at the time and I had known them since they came into care. And when I got their disclosure packet and I'm reading through it, and there's all this stuff in there that I knew wasn't even true. It was stuff they had made up, so they had something to talk about when they went. And so my point is, what good did that do? Did it bring any healing? No, because we were dealing with things that weren't true. So if we jump all the way back to where we started today with some of the symptoms of living in the survival part of our brain, and one of them is that clogged filter, if a parent or caregiver is not there, we run the risk of all that time being invested is around something that's not even accurate. Not only that, but I struggle with taking a child who has been the victim of abuse, neglect, another trauma, right? No child wakes up in the morning and says, hi, could you please make sure my life falls apart today? And yet they're the only identified client because their behaviors are problematic. Why then can you take a child such as my daughter, who was adopted 6 times before us, and she didn't last more than 3 or 4 months, and yet we could take her at the tail end and get her into adulthood? Because we parented differently, because we had education on things that were effective with kids. I'm not going to say she wasn't hard, she was. But we weren't punitive. We didn't have expectations. I didn't need her to make me look good. I already had grown kids when we adopted her, and they were quite successful, so I knew I wasn't a terrible mom. Do you hear what I'm saying? So I think we have to really look at what's happening. And if I'm not facilitating the attachment and I'm not doing it with the family, and I tell kids, I'm going to ask your mom, your dad, your auntie, your uncle, your grandparents, whoever you're with, I'm going to ask them to make as many changes as I'm going to ask you. And that puts kids at ease, and they're much more willing to participate. And sometimes I just need to work with the parents, because the parents just need to adapt and change some of their approaches, and the child will respond. 90% parental change, 10% kiddo adjustment. That's how we see things when we're looking through the lens of developmental progress, right? Have you ever seen a child put into therapy because they weren't talking soon enough? I mean, maybe speech therapy, but I'm talking about mental health therapy. Have you ever seen a child put into mental health therapy because they didn't walk until they were 14 months? No, those are just developmental things that we work with. Medical things, medical therapy sometimes, OT, PT, speech, to get them to develop, but we don't pathologize it at all. What would happen if we didn't pathologize trauma and instead focused on developmental progress? Would we get a little bit farther. When I say body-based techniques too, we want to focus. When I go into a home, there are a lot of times that parents will lead off by saying to the child, you need to sit still and listen to Miss Lauren. And I'll have to pull the parents aside later and say, no, I'm okay with Johnny rolling all over the floor when I'm here because his body needs to move because he's anxious when I'm here. And he's anxious because every time I come, mom and dad make some changes. And even if they're good changes, it's transition, and transitions are hard. So I'm okay if he rolls around on the ground because he'll get more out of it than what we're doing. So that's one example. That's why I like to see kids in their home, in their environment where they can roll around on the ground. I like to have kids on trampolines and use, I am so cold that my nose is running, so forgive me. Trampoline and sensory balls and communicating with kids because you get out a few words and the ball goes and they catch it and they give you a few words and it's all in manageable chunks but high energy. It's not just sitting and expecting a child who's been in school all day to sit and have this great deep conversation. But it is also taking everything back to their primary caregiver to work on that connection. I don't need kids to trust me. I don't need kids to have a relationship with me. I need them to trust their caregivers and I need them to have a relationship with their caregiver because that is what's going to build adaptive functioning to get them through to adulthood. We may need to redefine success, but in a successful way. Repeated positive experiences between a child and caregiver is the other effective thing that we want to look for in effective treatment. So again, remember 400 to 500 positive responses to the same negative stimuli will change a neuropathway. Let me bring this together. So I mentioned earlier that one of my daughters had sex in the front yard in the middle of the day in a deed-restricted neighborhood. And I had neighbors calling me, and that was a first. It was a new thing to add to my resume. So I had that on, and people were like, well, how did you handle that? And let's look at it from this perspective. Was I going to march out in the front yard and say, you may not have sex in my front yard, go to your room? Was I going to say, you're grounded for 3 weeks? Okay, let's look at having sex in the front yard. Does that give you any indicator about how she felt about herself? About her dignity? About even what's socially okay and what's socially not okay? We'd had her about 2 weeks when she had lived with us about 2 weeks. So you know what I did? I walked out in the front yard when my neighbors called me and I threw my arms around her and I said, sweetheart, I want to thank you. I travel all over this country helping parents learn how to help their hurt kids heal. And because of you, I always have a new story. And I went back in the house. And people said, that's really what you said? And I said, really, what am I going to say? Go to your room? And so here's what I knew. She'd been adopted 6 times before us and kicked out for things a little bit more minor than that. So I know in her mind, I knew it was going to be weeks before she was regulated because she knew we were going to kick her out too. So I didn't do anything except the drive-bys, and I'd walk through the kitchen and I'd say, oh baby, when you know your value, it's going to be a good day. I'd walk through and say, oh, when you find a man who knows how to treat you right, we're going to have a party. And I'd walk back through. I was doing this one by the seat of my pants, I will tell you. I told you I'd never had that experience and it was a little outside my comfort zone. But what I did know was that lecturing her, it pointed to much more underlying brokenness in her heart and the value she needed to have. And after doing that about 2 weeks, and she knew she wasn't going anywhere, we were able to start to address it. But you can't punish that kind of behavior out of a child because it is screaming, I am not worth anything. And I need people to love me, and I will do whatever they ask me to do, wherever they ask me to do it, because I need to be loved. That experience for us, I think, made a difference. Because I think she fully expected us to kick her out or yell at her or degrade her. And when none of that happened, I think she went, oh, maybe I can do differently. Maybe I can do better. And that would be where I got my 12-year-old from. So that experience. I have a 12-year-old. And that's where she came from. When she asks how she was born, I think I'll leave that part out. I think, again, that those repeated positive experiences between a child and caregiver, where children feel valued, they feel safe, and they feel like their needs are being met. And we can do that with caregivers and have them do the work. I'll tell you, it's a little more complex when you're having to deal with more than one person in a session, right? You have to be a little more thoughtful. And how am I going to take what I would generally do and have it done, transfer that to the caregiver and the child doing those interactions? But again, when I facilitate that, when my perspective is not to fix, my perspective is not to eradicate behaviors, but my perspective is I'm here to build relationships that will last into this child's adulthood and will bring healing. Because I won't be around, right? I'm not going to even be around at 3 o'clock in the morning when you have a nightmare and need to be comforted. I need you to be able to accept comfort from your caregiver, because that's the relationship that'll bring healing. So let's look at what's next. So now that we kind of understand trauma, how do we, as support persons, assist families' efforts for healing and connection? And I'm saying this because we need to understand the people raising these children and have as much compassion for them as we do the children. It's very easy, and kids we're serving are very good. Remember, they're survivors. So they can wrap you in really quick and really good. And they can create a perception of their primary caregivers that makes you not like them very quick. And when we buy into that and feed it, right, such as the therapist who said to me, why do you verbally abuse your daughter? I mean, it was ludicrous. And I don't care what people say because I know what's true. I just have that personality. But what about some of our parents that are unsure of themselves? Or a biological mom that has just been reunified with her child, and that transition of changing relationships is really challenging. How do we support them? So here are some common experiences of people parenting children from hard places. They often feel exhausted from having to educate everyone who interfaces with their children. From the school system to the therapist, I'm going to give you an example of something that we experienced last year. So I told you I have very trauma-impacted children and therefore very extreme behaviors because they also lack attachments. And we had a crisis group come in to help deal with our kids. And so we sat down with them and I said, I kind of want to tell you how this is going to go for you so you're prepared and we can have a plan in place. I said, the first time you talk to them, they are going to boo-hoo and tell you how horrible their life has been and all these horrible things that have happened to them. And some things will be true and some things won't. So it would be good to clarify with us what would be true and what's not. And then the next time you come, they're going to tell you how amazing you are and how much they can trust you already, and they just know that you're going to work really well together. And then the next time you come, they're going to start asking you for stuff. And so I'm asking you to please partner with us, because we need them to see us as the people who can keep them safe and meet their needs. And because they have attachment issues, that's really challenging for them. So I need you to partner with me. Please don't buy them things. Tell them to ask their mom and dad. My kids started coming home with new sweatshirts, with tickets to Busch Gardens, with all these other things. And I said, I thought we had an agreement before you came in. I said, you're damaging my kids by doing this, because what you're telling them is that mom and dad can't keep them safe and meet their needs, but you can. So unless you're willing to take them into your home, and I'm happy to sign whatever documents it will take for you to do that, I really wish you'd stop. And they continued. And they would say, so my kids were at the level where, expelled from school, arrested for assault, very high needs kids. And they would say, well, we're going to take them to Main Event, which is an arcade. And I would say, no. I said, you're here to help build the family, not to go take them to do fun things and then bring back dysregulated kids to us, so that once again, as parents, we don't do anything fun, because we can't. If we take them out in public, they attack people, they break things, they stand up in the middle of the church and yell obscenities. So you're right, we don't go a lot of places. But for you to take them there sends the wrong message and is counterproductive to their healing. So they called in an abuse report when I fired them. Didn't go anywhere because we don't do anything. But I did eventually fire them, because I just said, you're harming my children, not helping them. But it's an approach that people don't, it's hard, because we look at therapists as the therapist comes in and takes care of the child in those arenas. It's a privilege as a parent to take care of those arenas in our children. And we shouldn't take that from anyone. But that was my point, was we have to educate everyone that interfaces with our children. They often second guess themselves and waver in parenting how they know is best in order to keep the peace. We have been accused over the many years. I said we have 20 children, but we also fostered about 120. So we have been parents to a lot of different children. And we've learned some things along the way, as you do. And people would say, oh, you're being too strict. Well, attachment work sometimes looks strict, because I need you with me, not with other people. Oh, well, you're just controlling. Well, no, not really, if you know my goal. But this is what families, again, because my personality is, I don't really care what you think, because you're not raising my kids. But what about families who are new on the journey or don't have support in place? So they adapt their parenting to make people around them happy. I can't tell you how many times, and I listen to a lot of foster, adoptive, and just community parents and birth parents, and they'll say, I get told that I'm spoiling my child because I won't punish them. I'm getting told that I don't care about my children because I don't give them consequences that don't relate to what they're doing. I get told that my kids are just normal kids and I'm exaggerating the things they do. And so those parents give up to keep the peace. They often feel blamed for their children's behavior. I had a probation officer tell my husband that he was a piece of shit parent because my child had an arrest. And it was like, you just want to look and go, oh, whoa. He has bent over backwards to help facilitate what these kids need. Again, he wasn't particularly offended. I had a child who was a runaway, and we went into a court in Pasco County, and the judge said to me, "What's so bad at your house that she needs to run away?" And I said, "Oh, Your Honor, she isn't running away. She's running too. She needs a boy to validate who she is, and that's where she's running to. There is no running away." "Well, I think there's something at your house." "Well, you don't even know me. You don't even know me." So and again, I'm giving you examples, but this is how, what research shows families parenting trauma-impacted children feel. They often feel alienated by church communities, faith communities. Yeah, I won't go into that one. I have a lot to say there. They often, and my husband's a pastor, so I'm allowed to say a lot there. They often feel targeted by well-meaning persons who don't understand triangulation and survival behaviors of manipulation. Right? Told you, I'm going to suck you in because I need to get what I can get out of you because I'm a survivor, and that's how I survive. One of my boys, every day the school would call me and say, "We've asked you to send his backpack to school with him." And I'm like, I swear he walks out of my house every morning with a backpack on his back. So I thought one day, I am going to figure out what's going on here because I know he's walking out. And so we lived on 3 acres of land, and the bus stop was right in front of our house. And I watched that little sucker walk out the door with his backpack on, walk to the bus, go all the way to the back of the bus, open the window, and chuck it into a group of shrubs we had at the front. He wanted them to think he didn't have a backpack because then they gave him stuff and they felt sorry for him because he was so little and cute, and he was. And my one of the last crews, she would go to school. And when they came, due to the violence, I took all processed sugar out of our house and did everything organic because I thought, let me do the physical healing along with the other parts. And I would pack these, organic food's expensive. And I would pack these great lunches for them. And she would dump them in the garbage can, take her empty lunchbox into school, and she'd walk around with it open in the office going, "My mom said she didn't give me anything for lunch today. Do you have some snacks I can have?" Because they had Pop-Tarts and granola bars and everything that was not healthy and not healing or substantial. And they all just bought right into it. And so it's not the kids' fault. It is survival. And they're good survivors. But the adults have to work, and that's where they feel targeted by well-meaning people. Well, you just need to be kinder to them, and I could do a better job. And I'm like, great. When will you sign up? I'm happy to. And they often feel alone in the journey as family and friends begin to distance themselves from the hard, because people don't know how to be around really challenging trauma behaviors because it's out of their realm of comfort. And I tell families often when I go to work with them, I wish with everything in me that it were a formula I could give you on what to do with your kids and make everyone's life better. But it's not. And if I had that formula, I would be a rich woman and I'd be retired and sitting on a beach in Bali. But I am not. I am in Tampa, and we will need to try different things and different techniques, and healing will happen based on how much you're willing to adapt your parenting and on the child's history and their capacity to even receive care. So some key principles for a support community. Support we offer should be focused on the caregiver or parent. Okay? The child needs a present, healthy, and invested family. They don't need, I don't know how many people are in here, but I will tell you, I started in drug treatment, was where I started my career. I haven't ever heard from any of the people I saw in treatment, right? They've gone on with their lives. Sometimes we, as clinicians, we as professionals in the field, think that we're a little more important than maybe we are. And when we can shift our perspective and understand that for a child, the most important persons in their life are the ones that are with them every day, and we don't need gratification from the relationship, we're willing to pass that along to the caregiver, it's going to be great. I had a teenager say to me a couple weeks ago, "Miss Lauren, I don't like you." And I said, "Well, that's okay, because I don't need you to like me." I said, "I need you to like your mom. How's that going?" And when you keep that role, because again, this population, I need to manipulate because it's a survival skill. I'm not being manipulative for the sake of being manipulative. I am manipulating to survive. So I need you to align with me against the people I'm scared to connect to, and that's who I live with. So I need you to align with me and take my side. And when I don't align, because I align with the family as a whole unit, that's scary for kids. But that's where healing happens. Healing does not happen in therapeutic intervention or technique. It happens in relationship, day-to-day, boring, mundane development of relationship. My husband grew up in a very trauma-impacted household. Dad was a very violent alcoholic. There were 3 boys in the family, and all 3 have turned out pretty good. And in talking about why, because there was no therapy, you had to be really crazy to have therapy back when we were, my age group were kids. And therapy had a lot of stigma to it when we were little. So they never got therapy. They never got anything. But my husband will say, I am successful and able to be a good dad, a good husband, have a career, because there were key people in my life. My band leader, my Boy Scout troop leader, and my next door neighbor who was a pastor and just taught him how to work on cars, taught him how to do all that stuff. He said, that's why I ended up okay. Now, he would have been in foster care had he grown up in this era, and I wonder if he would have turned out the same. Because would he have had the opportunity for those relationships, or would the trauma have continued? So again, no easy answers, no one size fits all. Each situation is different and takes different assessment. But do we see the family unit at the core of everything good for a child, whatever that family may be? And then outside the family, that child's village. Development of the relationship is not with the child, it's with the family. It's vital that the family's ability to keep the child safe and meet needs is always the focus for both the child and the support of the family. So what does real support look like? So when we continue to be trained and we understand trauma and trauma recovery, that's what support looks like, because well-meaning helpers can cause a lot of significant damages to a child's primary relationships. When you question my ability to keep a child safe, what you're actually doing is telling the child, once again, you're not safe. You are continuing to be a victim. and we have got to help our kids stop being victims. I have often told some of my older kids, you were a victim when you were younger. Now you have to volunteer to be a victim because you've been safe for a lot of years. So what do you need? How can I walk with you? But you're not a victim anymore. All interactions with the child are centered on the relationship with the caregiver parent. That means we ask permission to give anything to the child. Right? If it's a child's birthday, I don't bring them something unless I've asked them, the parent. And I will say, I asked your mom if I could give you this, and she said yes. Why? I'm going back to that's the person tasked with keeping you safe. And so I'm going to do that, not because I have a need to ask the parent permission, and I know the parent would be fine with it, but no, it's to model to the child that I think your mom is safe. And so you can feel safe too. Your mom meets your needs. She keeps you safe. Your dad meets your needs, keeps you safe. Your auntie, grandma, on and on. Okay? So we ask permission to give anything to the child, especially food. Because children who've experienced trauma, food becomes very important. Sometimes that's because of early deprivation and they have hunger written in their DNA. Sometimes it's because sugar and carbs are interpreted by the trauma brain as nurture. So I'm very drawn to sugar and carbs. So let me flip that by saying that high protein every 2 hours and increased water are critical for part of the physical healing for this population. The excess cortisol that we talked about this morning also impacts the pancreas, and it can cause very significant sugar fluctuations. So by keeping protein even in the body, it makes a huge difference. And I have been successful with having high protein snacks every 2 hours written into 504 plans and IEPs so kids can have it at school. The teacher will keep it at her desk. So that's important. Anyway, it is, again, all interactions with a child centered on that relationship. When I go into a home, it's very frequent that kids will run up to give me a hug. And a lot of times it could be the first meeting. And I always take a step back and I scooch down to their level and I go, ooh, I'm still a stranger. You need to ask mommy or daddy, whoever's there, permission. And if they say when they say I'm safe, then I can give you a hug. But right now, let's just high five. And we high five. Why? Because I think it would be a problem? No, but because that also is an unconscious manipulation to align with me right away, right? But it also shows poor boundaries. And do I want to contribute to a child having indiscriminate affection with strangers? That increases their risk in the community 100-fold. So it's looking at things through different lens. And when we start to look at those things through a different lens, our roles become clear in how we can help instead of hurt. So when we're looking at caregivers, especially around the child welfare system, what training have they received? And so the connected parenting approach does involve a lot of counterintuitive interventions, right? Everything we've talked about today is a little counterintuitive to traditional parenting, traditional therapy, correct? Okay. And it's different from that because it's focusing on healing the brain through structure and nurture, but a lot of times it can be misunderstood by people outside the family. However, we have to know that attachment is foundational for the child. And so we really work hard with like when we have families come in that we're training, we really focus heavy on trauma and how to build those attachments and those things. But the reason I bring that up is because caregivers have received training. And so because they've received training, sometimes they know more than the professionals they interface with. And always, they know the children better than the professionals they interface with. So we have got to look at these substitute families with respect and equality rather than coming in and trying to find fault with them. Instead of looking for fault, what are they doing right? Where do they need help? How can I help them? But how the best way I can help the child is to help their caregivers. So let me open these last few slides up because I know that it's very outside the box of what we're used to, and I just want to make sure that any questions or comments or challenges are noted. So those of you that are watching virtually, feel free to stick things in the chat and I will have someone read them so we can talk about them. So let me ask this. For how many of you, I know Center for Attachment, I know Safe Families, I know you all have TBRI input, but how many of you is this somewhat new for, some of this information? Okay. For those of you who have been exposed to TBRI, was it difficult initially to make that switch?
For me, I think it's now I forgot what the conscious. Like you consciously have to think about parenting differently, because if you revert back to how I was parented when I was growing up, like that's counterintuitive. So you have to actually think through, I have to take a 12-second delay and like, okay, how is this going to work or benefit, or what's going to amount of it?
Okay. That's good.
I wouldn't say necessarily the transition is hard, but when we were talking about the food and them getting it at the school and stuff, a lot of them come from the transactional world, right? So all they're used to, even if they came from a shelter and stuff like that, is, oh, somebody brought my mom this was brought to us. So it's even really just because with our volunteers, anybody would be excited if they could do something for them to make them feel better. So it's hard to transition them to really understand, like, this relationship has to be built, and you're letting the relationship be built if you make it back to what they're used to, and that's a transaction.
That's good. That's a great point.
Maybe there's not. How would you direct a caregiver to handle a child who becomes explosive and hurt others, gives false reports to teachers about sexual abuse and physical abuse, destroys property?
Okay, that is a really big question to break down because there were a lot of different issues and dynamics going on in that. But I think, to make sure that the caregiver understands trauma as well as everyone who's interfacing with that child, so they can form a team that's built on supporting the caregiver and her caregiving capacity. And I mean, yes, challenging things happen. I own a child placing agency, so I have a child placing license, and a verified abuse report would put me out of business. And I have 3 children whose hobby is calling in abuse reports. And they get really creative, I have to say, except they've used the same allegation for 7 years. So now CPIs have quit coming out. And I've said to them, you guys really put yourselves at risk, because I could do anything I wanted now and they don't come out anymore because they don't believe you. So new adaptation. But it's hard for people going through it. We've just done it for so many years. You know, most people have a spare bedroom in their house. I have a CPI, Pasco County Sheriff bedroom in my house. So we've normalized it. It's not normal for most people, and it's terrifying. And caregivers are out there on their own. But I know for the families we serve, if there's an abuse report, we're with them during the investigation, just to say, We support you. Reread the different dynamics. So I heard the likes to make abuse reports or
Well,
out.
she has a follow-up question, though.
Okay.
She wants to know about calm down corner versus restrain in those physical aggressions.
So I think it's really finding out. I like a calm down place. I think we use whatever method we can to not integrate force into it, because force is going to put everything about me on high alert and is going to trigger all of that fear, and I'm back in survival mode. So what can I best do if I can calm, if there's a safe place I can be? But I like to have kids not sent to the safe place, but be present with someone in the safe place. So there are a lot of times I'll watch a kid rage. I'm just sitting in the corner so I don't get, clobbered by something that's flying. But I will often say, I just want to be present with you. I don't want anyone to feel as miserable as you do and be by themselves. So I'm just going to sit here. And I do. I mean, I have crawled under beds. I have climbed in trees. I have done all sorts of things that I now think I'm too old to be doing. But I had a 13-year-old. We were sitting at the table with mom and dad. I don't know, something triggered him, never figured it out. And he ran in his room and slammed the door. And I said, hey, buddy, we're going to open the door to resolve this. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to, calm down. And then we're going to come in. And he didn't come out. So we went in and he had crawled under his bed. And I just sat on the edge and I said, buddy, are you really going to make me crawl under this bed with you? Because I'm an old lady and I don't know if I can get out. And he didn't say anything. So I crawled under the bed and I just laid next to him, patted his back. And again, eventually he calmed. We came out. But I used that. I was not doing it to replace a caregiver. Caregivers were so burnt out, they didn't have the capacity, and I was modeling for them what the outcome could be if they did things differently. And I let caregivers know that. I don't want to keep doing this. I want you to be the one to intervene, but I will do it to model for you as long as we can get there. So again, I think we always use the least restrictive method possible. I'd also say that destroying stuff, although it's not pleasurable, and I have had to watch lots of my stuff get destroyed, if it's not dangerous, leave it alone. It's restraints for me are when the child or others are really at physical risk of harm. I think before we go into that, I want to spend a little more time on what are some of the paradigm shifts that we want to make in our community. So let's contrast for a minute. We have traditional talk therapy, and we've said kids can't process more than 12 words when they're living in the middle part of their brain. So that's kind of wasted, right? They're not using the logic part of their brain. Let's contrast for a minute. So using TBRI, which is relationship-based, focused on developmental progress and the healing of the brain through changing neuropathways and creating new neuropathways, versus some of our more traditional methods of parenting, therapies, all of that. What can we put into this category of TBRI that's different? Where do we see that long term? Because we always are wanting to look long term, right? What is the long term message about? If you had one word and you wanted to know that a child you had worked with within a family was successful, what would define success for you?
My one word is reshaping.
Reshaping? Okay. Loved?
Safe
Safe?
or healthy.
Okay. Healthy? Resilient? Okay. Let me address that word, not necessarily in this context, but I want to make sure everyone watching too understands. I hear too often in child welfare that kids are resilient, but they're resilient like rubber bands, and if you stretch them one too many times, they snap. So children do have varying levels of resiliency, and it's an amazing thing, but we can never let that be an excuse in our professional work to not do everything we can to alleviate it. And so, sorry, I just picked your word because it's my, I knew how you meant it, but I wanted to clarify for everyone watching. Okay, yes.
Lisa is saying relationship.
Good.
Deborah, emotionally self-regulated.
Okay, emotionally self-regulated. So I think in our world, we have to redefine success and we have to redistribute the balance of power. Because traditional therapy through the years, if you look at its progression, has made the therapist important to bring healing to the people with whom they interact. Okay? Now, again, I'm talking more about, I'm not talking about like marriage counseling or things, but let's even use that as an example, right? Let's say couple struggling, they have to go to marriage counseling. What would have happened 50 years ago? Who would they have gone to? Pastor, grandma and grandpa, mom and dad who'd been married 50 years, right? It happened within community, within relationship. But see, what's happened is we have become a more scattered culture. We don't have the neighborhoods. People don't always grow up in the same area and have the same friends all through their growing up years. More transiency. Well, what happens with this is it erodes the community supports that used to be around the families. So in this relationship approach, we also have to look at community dynamics and how can we create that community that families need for support. There was a guy whose name is Jason Weber. He is the director of CAFO, which is Christian Alliance for Orphans, out of, I think it's out of Texas. But anyway, he was in town and speaking, but his focus was on community and church collaboration to wrap around and change the dynamics by coming outside of the paradigm. And he gave this example that I loved, and there was a small town in Nebraska where a farmer's barn flooded. And it kept flooding, and it was his livelihood, and it kept ruining everything that was in there. And yet to build a new barn was not realistic cost-wise. And so they did research, and they found, they talked about moving the barn, and people laughed and said, you can't move a barn. And the entire community came together, and I'm taking out pieces just to make, but the entire community came together, and they had put steel girders and determined that every person who lifted, needed to be able to support 55 pounds. So their entire community came around that barn, and they lifted and moved that barn to a totally dry place, got it down, and everything was good. So what was overwhelming for one family that they never could have figured out and done on their own was done with the collaboration of community. And I think when we begin to see our families in view of how do we help them help themselves, right? We don't do it for them. Doing things for people is not helpful. Bringing people stuff is not helpful. Teaching them how to do this stuff on their own is empowering, and the more empowered they are, the healthier they'll be. So what does that look like in each of our communities that we're engaged in? How do we really bring support? And so when I'm talking about shifting paradigms, it's because TBRI is relationship-based, but it's relationship-based with the child who then relies on healthy adults for the relationships, who then rely on a healthy community to support them in the difficult job of healing trauma, and it goes out from there. Children really are our community's investment, not just one family. So we all do well to focus on doing that and making some of those paradigm shifts from where we've been. We tend to live in a very siloed society. My little group is here, your little group is there. Well, what if your little group had something to offer my family that I don't have, or quite frankly don't really want to do, and your organization could come around and support that, then that would be great. I'll give you a very concrete example. I have a daughter who, due to her limitations, has really struggled with being independent, and she always comes back home, but she never gets independent because our house is too safe for her. And she knows we'll take care of her. So I decided that what would be best for her is to get her engaged with someone else that she could hear the same thing from and feel a little more motivated. And so I actually called Jewel, and she's with Safe Families, and they were able to intervene and have 2 of her kids in a host family, which just about killed me as their grandparent, but I knew it was best for my child. And it works. Why? Because the community came around so that we could focus on relationship with her and not having to play every role. So that's an example of how community can collaborate and do that. So I hope that kind of gave you a picture of what it can look like in practice, as far as we talked before the break on differences and perspective shift. That's a very different perspective looking at how to deal with behaviors, isn't it? Because most of us are, I just want the behavior to stop. I think going back to what Sarah was saying, it takes more effort to do things this way because you do have to think. But we pay now or we pay later. And if we are paying now and putting the effort in and taking the extra time to do it, our returns are going to be much better in the long run because we're going to have happy, healthy children instead of children that have made no progress. You have to be thoughtful in doing it, and it takes practice. Once you start practicing, it comes very naturally, but it takes practice to switch some of those things around. I think just to integrate too, earlier I talked about thinking of behaviors in green, yellow, and red. I think our key is we really have to be mindful to going from green into yellow, because the earlier we catch and teach caregivers to catch, the quicker we can reverse it back to green. So that is part of, for caregivers, their attunement with the child. And if we're seeing they're not attuned, we want to help them learn how to attune to the child. I had done an intensive weekend not too long ago. I'm trying to think of where this one was. Oh, I know, it was actually in Tampa. But what an intensive weekend is I will go, it's usually out of town when they don't have resources. And I do Friday afternoon to bedtime, all day Saturday from time child gets up to goes to bed, and then half a day Sunday. So we can get some good neuropathway change in a short amount of time. But anyway, I was at the house and Mom just said, I said, what was most helpful this weekend, or how can I support? And she said something I didn't anticipate and it stuck with me. But she said, you always were able to catch him before he went too far and were able to stop it. And I wish I had the ability to do that. And I said, you do. You just have to pay attention. But the reality is, for a lot of the caregivers we work with, they have a house full of these kids. And so it can make it a little more challenging, but I think we have to empower not just children and give them a voice, but we have to empower caregivers and give them a choice and include them in the process so that they understand we are seeing them as a vital part of the most important part of this child's healing because they're the attachment relationship. So I am going to briefly just cover some arenas and practical suggestions in physical, social, emotional, intellectual, how we can meet the needs in those areas, just a few helpful suggestions. And then we're going to open up for questions. And then tomorrow, we're really going to dig in. How do we apply all this to the stuff we do? What does it look like? And for instance, therapeutic supervised visitation. What does it look like in assessing attachment between a child and a caregiver? I want to clear up some misconceptions that even our courts have, where I got a call yesterday and they said a psychiatrist ordered that mom and child have therapy for bonding. Well, we don't want bonding. We want attachment, and therapy's not going to do it. That's going to be, you hear what I'm saying? Because they were insinuating talk therapy. That's not going to form attachment. So I think there's a misunderstanding all around. And so as we talk about those practical things tomorrow, my other hope is that empowers you to go back into your realms and be equipped to really advocate for what kids need and not some of the ruts we've fallen into, like therapy is the magic cure for everything. Okay, so let's look at physical. I told you before, high protein every 2 hours and increased hydration. I don't know, I told you the physical reason why the increase in protein. I don't know the scientific reason behind it, but trauma dehydrates. So there are neurochemicals that are affected by trauma: dopamine, epinephrine, neuroepinephrine, glutamate, serotonin. What am I missing? Did I get it all? But for instance, if glutamate is too high, it can cause psychogenic seizures. If dopamine is too high, it can cause intense aggression. If serotonin's too low, it can cause depression. So those are all affected by trauma and the levels. Unfortunately, our medical community has not caught up to the brain research, so insurance will not cover neurochemical panels, but they can be done. I think there's probably also some big pharma push in it because with neurochemicals being out of whack, most of it can be corrected through diet and supplement rather than psychotropic medications. But I'm hoping at some point insurance will catch up and cover that because it could revolutionize lives. So, increased protein, increased hydration. When I'm at the camp, we give every child a water bottle, and they have to have it with them at all times, and we're just making sure that they're hydrated. Think about it. When you're dehydrated, you feel yucky. When you feel yucky, your body doesn't know how to process that, and we end up with meltdowns. Up and down movement is one of the best ways to get rid of excess cortisol. So in schools, I will frequently have school staff just take a child out into the hall and do some jumping jacks together. I really stress we never do it punitive. Give me 20. We don't do it punitive. We say, let's do some jumping jacks together. And preschools all have teachers bunny hop their kids between activities instead of walking, because that up and down movement will keep cortisol levels lower. The best way is a trampoline. For years, I had an 8-foot trampoline in my family room. We just sadly took it down recently because one of the legs broke. And now that I'm down to not as many kids, I don't know if I'll replace it or not, but it was the best thing we ever did because they would start to get dysregulated. They would recognize it, go jump on the trampoline, and we were done because it would pull those levels down. Really limiting sugar and carbs for the reasons I told you our kids are drawn to that, but they don't process it as well and really need those proteins in their place. So those are just some physical ideas. Active is good. Combining activity and clinical work is really good. Hanging upside down for 10 seconds will resync the brain. So I'll often have kids flip off the end of a couch and they come back up and we're in a different place. Another physical thing we can do is the brain hemispheres with trauma tend to act independently of one another instead of in tandem. So anything we can do to cross brain hemispheres. So here's a simple one. We pull it up and go like this, just crosses brain hemispheres and can get the brain, both sides communicating with each other, taking your left leg, touching your right hand behind your back. I'm too old to get my leg all the way up there, but you know what I'm talking about. So again, those kinds of physical things can be really helpful. If I'm going to get to know a child in the confines, I don't ever just sit and ask questions. I bring a bunch of my fidgets or sensory balls and things like that, and I'll throw them and answer questions. So we're combining activity with cerebral stuff, and it makes the brain work together. So that's important. Social. Again, if our kids are socially delayed, how do we help them catch up? Well, I want to say something that might be a little bit radical, but we can't catch them up till we make sure the needs of the age level they're at are met. So instead of being in a hurry to have them act appropriately, go back and enjoy. Isn't it cute when a 4-year-old asks a question that is just so offensive to adults, but they're so genuine in their question because they're curious, like, why are you so fat? Why are you so white? Why are you, how little kids are, they're just honest.
Yeah, I've been asked, why are you black?
Oh.
I have no idea how to answer that question.
I get asked how old am I? Why am I old? And I'm like, because I'm very wise. That's why. But we embrace that. But if a 10-year-old does that, a parent would die, right? And yell at them, and that's not appropriate. Well, let him be curious, and those around can be the adults. So my point is, let them experience some of the stage that they haven't, so that they are free to move on because the needs of that developmental stage have been met. And we don't need to flip out over everything. I find a lot is because caregivers are embarrassed about the child's behavior. And I think it's really important to help caregivers just put aside embarrassment. Embarrassment is a shame feeling. So I think a lot of times it kicks into other dynamics. And certainly if a parent has unresolved history of trauma, boy, can a child trigger that quicker than anything else. So just be aware of dynamics. Emotional. So here's what I want to say about emotions are important, but emotions are, right? Do you wake up in the morning and dictate what emotions you're going to feel during the day? They just come on you, right? You feel them. And so it's important to identify what they are, but the reason it's important to identify what they are is so that you can then identify what the thought processes driving them are, right? Because I can't change emotion, but I can change my thought processes. And so, I have done some work with that, and it's really good for, like, they'll tell me where in their body, so we combine an exercise, where in your body do you feel, we identify 5 negative emotions, take one at a time. Where in your body do you feel this? What happens to make you feel that? Because a lot of times there's a disconnect there. And then when you have that feeling, what is your brain telling you? And it's really interesting. No one likes me. I wasn't wanted. a lot of big, well, those we can change. So then we go through all the thoughts, and the child does it with mom and dad present and my guidance. And is this true or false? And we mark them true or false. And then we go back and we change the false ones to true statements. And for the true statements, we come up with a way to cope and blend the correct emotion with that thought process. So, which gives a child a feeling of, I really can make some changes. I can't control this huge anger that just comes on me. I don't know how to fix that. And I think we don't realize, I told you about the little girl I had seen last night, and mom's face kind of said disgust. That's not what came out of her mouth, but her face said that. And I asked the little girl if she would draw me a picture of her family before I left. And she drew a picture, but then she put little bubble words, and again, it was an international adoption, so she's still learning English. But she said, I hope I can change. I hope God and my mom and my dad can still love me while I change. And I just thought, it was just heartbreaking that this little girl, that's her life. And you can tell by looking at her, she's miserable. But I think it's because she can't do anything right. And I don't know that any of us could survive under that constant stress. And I think there are some other issues going on with her where there might be some cognitive processing issues. So, but my point is, it's about relationship, and kids need to feel valued, and they need to feel empowered to be different, but they also need to know that I accept you and am committed to you based on you, not based on what you do or don't do. Okay, so physical, social, emotional, intellectual. Just an interesting science fact is when a child hits an academic barrier, increase physical activity. When they hit a physical barrier, increase academic activity. And it will unstick their stuckness. I don't know if that's a word, but it worked there. So those are just, little things to get you thinking. But we can't just treat the emotions of a child because it's a small piece of the child and it's the delayed part of the child. So we want to wrap in the whole child to what we're doing and help families wrap the whole child and see them. All of those things make a difference and help. And that hopefully helps you make more sense out of why we say that caregivers are the best therapists. Because they're the ones feeding their children. They're the ones engaging them in activities. They're the ones, so all of those pieces, we need to equip them to parent in a therapeutic manner.